Good evening. So the Crusades? As you all know, it is a rather complex topic. It is also a topic that lends itself to many contemporary references, more or less appropriate. We will discuss it for 3 consecutive evenings, which may seem like a lot. In reality, we will only be able to outline some of the fundamental aspects of the topic, and especially this first evening, before delving into the details. I think it is necessary to outline some very general coordinates of what the Crusades were, so that we can be sure we are talking about the same thing. What do we need to know about the Crusades? That we all studied them in school, of course, and so we all remember that it is an event from the Middle Ages, and that there were several of them. 5, 7, 9, I challenge anyone to remember exactly, but still quite a few numbered. They are bloody events, events that involve a strong conflict between the Christian West and the Islamic world. These are events that our civilization once celebrated with great enthusiasm at the time when poems like The Liberated Jerusalem were being written. Then they became events that more recently we have felt a bit ashamed of, as we have also come to recognize the immense violence that the Crusades entailed and the enormous explosion of hatred for those who are different, of the enormous outburst of anti-Semitism that appears in Europe for the first time precisely during the Crusades. I don't know if the wind is changing, but one of those questions is better left unasked. Not tonight, anyway. In any case, these are events that are part of our collective heritage as Westerners. What needs to be clear in order to follow the discussion? First, the Crusades are actually a very particular form of pilgrimage. This may not be such an obvious thing. Instead, it is true. The Crusades are a pilgrimage. We must think of a time when our Christian ancestors in Western Europe placed enormous importance on pilgrimage. I see Professor Odifredi smiling. Even now, the pilgrimage on the Way of St. James has become an important thing, and the radio broadcasts it. But we must think of a time when pilgrimage for Christians, especially the pilgrimage to the Holy Land, was felt almost as it is today for Muslims to Mecca, as an extraordinary cathartic moment. The moment when those who can experience firsthand all the profound meanings and also all the risks of their religion. I mention risks because obviously going on a pilgrimage to the nearest sanctuary was one thing, while going on a pilgrimage to the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem was another. Experiencing this, which for medieval Christians was felt as a powerful connection with Christ, being able to say, "He was here, I am," walking on the same ground he walked on. But of course, Christ suffered his passion there. And so, the pilgrimage to the Holy Land for medieval Christians also meant consciously taking the risk of meeting the same fate, to put it somewhat brutally. Knowing that one was setting out to do something dangerous, exhausting, and painful, being away from home for years, with concrete chances of not returning, of losing one's life along the way, and yet doing it. To do it for empathy with the passion of Christ, to do it for penance, to do it because it was believed that life had a meaning that went beyond daily concrete interests, and that sometimes that meaning had to be pursued, even at the risk of one's life. Thus, the crusade is a pilgrimage, but it is a very particular type of pilgrimage that begins at a specific moment. It is a pilgrimage that aims not only to go to liberated Jerusalem, to personally touch the Holy Sepulchre, but also to go there, armed, because there is a fear that those who possess liberated Jerusalem may not allow us to come or may cause us trouble. The goal is to go there, armed, to clear the way, so that all Christian pilgrims in the future can go there without danger, and to take possession of liberated Jerusalem, ensuring that it is in Christian hands. The premise, of course, is that there are some geographical and chronological coordinates we need to provide in order to understand each other. The premise is that Jerusalem was in Christian hands for centuries under the Byzantine Empire. Then the Arabs arrived, with the great expansion of Islam after Muhammad, and they conquered, among other places, the Holy Land. One might think that at that moment Christians viewed the crusade as a necessity to regain control of the holy places, which were so important in their mental perspective. In reality, it is not so. For many centuries, the Christian West neither had the forces nor the desire to undertake an armed reconquest. The relations with the Muslims who govern in the Holy Land, who govern liberated Jerusalem, are generally discreet. Charlemagne exchanges ambassadors with the Caliph Harun al-Rashid, making agreements to ensure that Christian pilgrims can travel freely, that they do not pay excessive tolls, and so on. At a certain moment, which is truly a crucial point in the history of the West, for various reasons that we will also try to explain later, Christians decide that something else is necessary, that an effort is needed, again a painful and laborious effort on the way of Christ, imitating the passion of Christ, fully committing themselves to ensure that this scandal, as they see it, comes to an end, and that Jerusalem is once again in Christian hands. This event has a very specific date. In the year 1095, a Pope, Urban II, decided to launch this project. With all the moral authority of the papacy, he invites Christians, Catholics, to go to the Holy Land, to go there in large numbers, to go there armed, to take possession of the holy places. Here begin the Crusades. Therefore, the Crusades are the story of those Christians who accepted the Pope's call, who felt, and their mindset worked this way, they felt with immense strength the allure of this call, and they put themselves on the line. By doing things that, with our values today, seem quite questionable, but which to them seemed sacred, they went and conquered Jerusalem. And this is the first crusade. But why are there so many others? Obviously, the Muslims did not remain inert in the face of the fact that a horde of barbarians from who knows where, moreover pagan unbelievers, had come to conquer in Islamic land, one of the holy cities of Islam, namely Jerusalem. Of course, Muslims felt it as a tremendous offense, an offense to them and an offense to God, that the infidels from the West had come to seize Jerusalem, the tomb of Christ, who is also a great prophet revered by Muslims. Therefore, Muslims immediately prepared to reclaim Jerusalem. For this reason, many crusades occurred, as Muslims, slowly, reconquered the territories taken by the Crusaders. The Crusaders continued to support the defense of these territories from Europe, with new expeditions, and it took 2 centuries for the Muslims to finally prevail and manage to drive the last Crusaders into the sea. What other parameters are necessary for us to understand each other when we try to delve a little deeper into discussing some aspects of the Crusades? I would say this. For a long time, historians have said, well, yes, it is understood. The propaganda claimed it was about going to conquer the holy places, the Passion, the tomb of Christ. But in reality, there were deep political and economic motivations underneath, a desire for conquest, a need to channel the demographic wealth of a growing Europe that was full of young people. At that time, it was Europe that was full of young people and sent them to the Maghreb, to North Africa, and to the Middle East. It's all true. But let's say that perhaps we today are also a bit better equipped, compared to what the historians of the 19th century were, for example, to understand that perhaps a people, an entire culture, can truly decide that the possession of a holy city is something fundamental for which it is worth risking one's life, even today, for the possession of Jerusalem. There are peoples that fight against each other, and certainly there are economic and political motivations involved, but we all have the feeling that there is also a strong religious motivation, pushing people to risk their lives and to kill. Thus, it was also the Christians who viewed things in these terms. It is true that the Crusades occur at a time when Europe is growing, has resources to expend, and has people to send out, because at home the inheritances have become smaller due to constant division. When a knight has only one son, everything is fine, and the inheritance goes to the son. But when he has 3, 4, or 5, someone must go seek fortune elsewhere. Indeed, the First Crusade also translates into an immense territorial conquest. I have always kept to the general terms: the Holy Land, Jerusalem, the holy places. The Crusaders, who conquered Jerusalem in 1099, traveled on foot, passing through the Balkans and Asia Minor. As soon as they found themselves outside the Christian Byzantine Empire and in Islamic territory, they began not only to cross, but also to conquer and permanently occupy the lands they traversed. Thus, the Crusaders established a kingdom that they called the Kingdom of Jerusalem, certainly because it had a perspective that was legitimized in the otherworldly dimension, where Jerusalem was what truly mattered. However, this kingdom, if one looks at today's maps, roughly corresponds to a large part of Syria, Jordan, Israel, Palestine, and Lebanon. It is a territory. Soon they will also add Cyprus. It is a territory of considerable size. So much so that today, historians do not hesitate to say that in the end, this is the first European colonial experiment. It is the first time that Europeans attempt to conquer a territory outside of Western Europe and to establish their own aristocracy of masters who command and govern. So this dimension exists. One of the challenges of these three lessons will also be to try to maintain a balance between these two dimensions, to try to imagine these people who, on one hand, truly believed, who seriously risked their lives for a purpose they considered pleasing to their God. He thought he was following in the footsteps of Christ, risking his life and potentially facing martyrdom, but at the same time, he also knew very well that this was an extraordinary opportunity for conquest, for enrichment, an extraordinary chance to leave home and occupy a higher position in the newly conquered world, overseas as they called it. Here, the coexistence of religious enthusiasm, which for many of us today may be difficult to understand in that dimension, was indeed present. We would be poor historians if we imagined that they did not have this. Well, they did have it, and how? The coexistence of this with unrestrained greed, the most shameless desire for conquest, is one of the things that are difficult to accept, and that I will try in some way to illustrate with examples. The crusade has been a fixed idea in the minds of people for a long time, for several generations, for more than a century. The people of the West have been willing to stake resources, military power, money and lives, from kings and emperors to the last of the peasants, for this collective purpose that everyone feels as a collective goal, to defend the Holy Land. And the crusade, in this sense, is an all-pervasive thing. It is not just the great expeditions that we count, those where kings and emperors set out, the second, the third, the fourth, but in reality, people are continuously departing. Anyone can decide to leave and go lend a hand in the Holy Land to those who are defending it. Anyone can decide, this is already a bit more convenient, but this also costs money, to leave in a will funds, to pay fighters to go to the Holy Land. It is a shared and widely practiced ideal. Then, over time, we gradually notice that people start to think about this ideal a little less. For many reasons. One is that things are going very badly anyway, because the Muslim reconquest is actually progressing, and despite the enormous efforts of the West, it is only being progressively delayed. However, things are going poorly. But this perhaps would not be enough. Another reason is that the crusade has become an institution that sometimes the authorities manage carelessly. Here, this is still a parameter that I had to remind you to provide. Let's do that now. To talk about the crusade, we must keep in mind that the crusade almost immediately after the first one, when it is understood that more will be needed, also becomes a legal institution of the West. Let me explain what this means. It means that an expedition is a crusade when the only moral authority that all Christians of the West recognize in those centuries, which unites them all, is that of the Pope. The Pope can be criticized as an individual, and one may not agree with him, but, as Pope, he is a moral authority recognized by all. Here, a crusade is declared when the Pope states that an expedition is a crusade, and that all those who depart from now on, in the coming months, are officially crusaders. Being officially crusaders becomes a legal status, in the sense that the Church puts its authority at stake to ensure that all powers, all kings, municipalities, and princes recognize privileges for those who participate. Small privileges for charity, necessary privileges. If you leave, the payment of your debts is postponed. They will not come to confiscate your property or your house while you are away. If you die, There is a special legal protection over your will wherever you die, to ensure that your family is guaranteed. Sufficient privileges to ensure that being a crusader is indeed a legal status, and the crusade is, in this sense, an institution. But why was I telling you that this thing is actually one of the reasons why the enthusiasm of many people starts to diminish in the long run? Because what happens is that the crusade, as we have said, can only be proclaimed by the Pope, and the Pope is a great moral authority that has a very specific purpose in these centuries, namely to impose himself as the arbiter of European politics, to convince all sovereigns and all states to accept his primacy. The period of the Crusades, from the late 11th century in 1099, with the conquest of Jerusalem, until the end of the 200s, is also the period in which the popes were seriously trying. It is the only period in the history of Europe so far in which the popes were seriously recognized as an authority to which even kings and emperors, albeit somewhat reluctantly, were willing to obey in many matters. So, some pope, but the popes always have opponents as well. Think of the long conflicts between the papacy and the empire, which are typical of the Middle Ages. There you go. At a certain point, some pope cannot resist the temptation. We have internal enemies. We have Emperor Frederick II, who is an evil Ghibelline, godless, protecting heretics, while good Christians go to be killed in the Holy Land, fighting against the infidels. But if we have them at home, the wicked, why shouldn't we proclaim a crusade against them as well? One can imagine that we discussed it, popes, cardinals, but they didn't discuss it much. They almost immediately decided that yes, it could be done. Why not? An emperor who is an enemy of the Pope or a band of heretics in Provence or Lombardy were just as much enemies of God as the Muslims over there across the sea. And so the popes began to proclaim crusades against their internal enemies. At this point, you understand what it means. It is a very concrete matter. Those who go have the right to certain privileges, but also to certain funding, of course, because the issue of crusades costs money. Even the Middle Ages needed money to wage war. Every crusade means complicated negotiations between the church and the king to decide how much you will contribute. The Kingdom of France can contribute a lot, but the bishops contribute. Oh no, the bishops do not contribute. Yes, they must contribute, and the Pope will convince them to contribute. So, if there is this discourse underneath, even the crusades against the Ghibelline emperor, or against the Cathar heretics of the Languedoc, are managed and financed in this way. And many set off, thinking that there is much to gain. There will also be plunder to be had, and God, moreover, is pleased and saves the soul. But the people of that time were neither more naive nor less naive than we are today. Even then, there are some who start to say, yes, it's convenient for the Pope to proclaim a crusade whenever it suits him. One thing is the crusade to go live in the Holy Land, the Passion of Christ. Another thing is to go massacre those poor heretics of whom we are not even sure who they are, or to fight the emperor whom the Pope calls an enemy of the faith, but, coincidentally, the emperor claims to be the true leader of Christianity. I won't make it long. This is certainly one of the reasons why enthusiasm for the Crusades is overall beginning to decline. Then there are others, very quickly. At a certain point, someone arrives from Italy and goes to the Holy Land, crossing the camps of the Crusaders. Instead of stopping there and saying, I am here, tell me when to fight, he goes a bit further, enters the camp of the Muslims, asks for the Sultan, and says, I have come here to discuss with the Sultan. His name was St. Francis. He was a highly debated figure in his time while he was alive, but after his death he was canonized. While he was alive, he caused a lot of trouble. One of the things that caused the most annoyance was going to the Holy Land and then once there saying, look, we shouldn't fight these people. Let's discuss it. Another sign of a change in attitude is Emperor Frederick II. It is no coincidence that the Pope became annoyed with him. At a certain point, he agrees to go on the crusade, saying, okay, I am an emperor, a Christian sovereign, I have to do this, it is a duty, I will do it, I will go. And once he arrived in the Holy Land, he went to the Sultan and said, but couldn't we come to an agreement? How much does it cost to recover Jerusalem? And for a moment, it is actually succeeding, except that there are powerful forces, as you can imagine, that do not find it right to resolve the matter in this way. On both sides. Here I have outlined, already wasting a lot of time, a set of aspects that help us understand what the crusade was and why the ideal of the crusade faded at a certain point. Okay, by the end of 200, when the Muslims have completed the Reconquista and thrown the last Christian rearguards into the sea, the enthusiasm in Europe is no longer what it once was. And thus the phenomenon of the crusade, in the perspective in which we know it in the Middle Ages, comes to an end. It concludes. Now, in these 3 evenings, we will examine various aspects of the crusading phenomenon in a bit more detail. We will talk about how Christians, at a certain point, began to think that war could be holy, whereas the early Christians had entirely different ideas about this. We will also discuss how, from this perspective, the Muslim world rediscovered those ideas of jihad that are indeed present in the Quran, but which had been largely forgotten for a long time, and how they regained circulation precisely with the Crusades. We will also talk about how the Crusades are an extraordinary opportunity for us who study that period to see our ancestors through the eyes of others, because the Crusades are the first occasion when Westerners in large numbers go out, meet the Byzantines, meet the Arabs, the Turks, the Muslims, and all these people observe with a certain dismay, I must say, generally, the Westerners, and describe them, writing books, letters, and treatises to tell who these very strange barbarians are. And for us, it is obviously a great opportunity to see our world, our medieval society, through the eyes of others. This tomorrow and the day after tomorrow. However, this evening I would like to try to do something a little different instead. I would like to try to immerse myself now. How can I put it? I have put all my precautions aside. Now I would like to take a moment to immerse myself in the mindset of those medieval Westerners who appreciated the crusade as a whole, without discussion, and see how and in what ways some great figures in our history became prominent precisely through their participation in the Crusades. In other words, I would like to emphasize that the judgment on the Crusades changes over time, yet the vast majority of us have heard of Godfrey of Bouillon and Richard the Lionheart. But why is that? Because they went on the Crusades. But who exactly were they? And how did they become models, examples, figures that have been remembered for generations? Very little about Godfrey of Bouillon. Godfrey of Bouillon is one of the leaders of the First Crusade. Regarding the First Crusade, perhaps we could still say this, that we have not yet mentioned Pope Urban II launches it, at a time when he is decisively aiming to be the leader of the West. This is also because that is the moment around the year 1000, the centuries around the year 1000, when the state in the West is weaker. The kings are present, but they are very weak. Power is entirely managed by the local lords in their castles, or by princes, who may own many castles in a certain area. Well, if we were here 1,000 years ago, there would be the Malaspina, all right? There are the Malaspina. They command in Lunigiana, and as far as Genoa, regional princes. Certainly not kings. At that time, power was managed entirely at that level. There was a ruler more powerful than the others, the emperor, who has just come out of that chapter of history that we all remember, which traumatized him a bit, the struggle for investiture. Do you remember Henry IV at Canossa, barefoot? There you go. After a trauma, like the conflict with the papacy, the emperor is also extremely weak. Why do I tell you this? For one simple reason. The First Crusade is the only one in which no king, and not even the emperor, participates, because they are in very poor condition at that time. It is no coincidence that the Pope chooses that very moment to come forward and organize a great collective undertaking of all Christian Europe. The kings are no longer competitors. There is the Pope, and there are the local princes who command at the regional level, and it is they who set out. The Count of Toulouse, Bohemond of Hauteville, the Norman who owned a piece of southern Italy, along with many other counts, and French dukes, each possessing a region, perhaps Burgundy or Normandy. Here is one of them, Godfrey of Bouillon, from the family of the Dukes of Lorraine. One among many. We know almost nothing about these many people. For that era, we still do not have, for example, private letters from a king. We do not have somewhat free testimonies from anyone who describes them even in private, as we will have later. I will then talk to you about Louis IX, the saint, for example. We have stories from close friends of Saint Luigi Nono, who share the most personal details. But some time has passed. In the 11th century, when the First Crusade begins, such things do not exist. Europe is still very backward at that time. And we see this precisely from the sources he leaves us. Godfrey of Bouillon, like all the others, we do not know who he truly was in his heart. We know that he became famous because among the many who set out, he was the one who, in the end, when they conquered Jerusalem, had been away from home for 3 years, and had already risked their lives several times, and now they had succeeded. They had conquered Jerusalem, ridden with their horses through the streets of the city and into the mosque with blood reaching up to the knees of the horses. And now they found themselves having conquered this immense country, immense from their point of view, quite large indeed from Turkey, to Egypt. And what do we do with this land? We are going home now, but not a chance. We will stay here to govern it, this new kingdom that we have conquered for God and for Christ. How do we organize it? I just told you that kings meant nothing. It was the princes who held the power. That is precisely why they decide to make a king. In this way, all the leaders can continue to command their respective parts of the territory, but there will be a primus inter pares who will hold very little authority, yet will possess the sacredness that kings have, because the king is a consecrated figure. We know nothing about how they chose him. We can only imagine the discussions. We don't know if they chose the bravest, which is the official version, or the one who caused the least trouble, or the one who was already a bit unwell, as he died almost immediately afterward. We know nothing about that. However, they choose Godfrey of Bouillon, who thus becomes the first king of Jerusalem, and the following year he dies. Well, clearly, he is the first king of Jerusalem. Then, a few centuries later, the legend helps to build a myth that remains rooted in our imagination. However, Godfrey of Bouillon is this. With all my goodwill, I couldn't tell you more. It's a bit lacking, as you can see, I would like to talk a bit longer about another example of a hero that emerges from the period of the Crusades. I mentioned Richard the Lionheart earlier, but I will leave him for later. I would like to focus more on another king who may be a little less known, but whom we have also heard of, Louis IX of France, Saint Louis of the French, the holy king of the 200 French. Louis IX of France is an extraordinary figure who fully embodies the ideal of the crusade, at a time when there are already those around him who begin to lose faith in it. It is the character not of someone who has nothing to lose, but of someone who has a kingdom to lose and decides to risk it to go to Jerusalem. And it is a great fortune for those who do my job, the protagonist of many stories, historical narratives. He is a figure who left a great impact on those who knew him. It was well known that he was a saint. Sometimes we would make him lose his patience a bit because of this, but he was different from the others. Those who met him immediately started writing. I met him. This and that happened. I saw him sitting on the ground administering justice. I spoke to him. I told him this thing, and he started laughing. We have many writings of this kind about St. Louis that allow us to construct the image of what was considered by all his contemporaries the ultimate example of a crusader hero. Who was Louis? Louis is someone who experiences the crusade very clearly, in the sense of a penitential pilgrimage. We must go to conquer Jerusalem. It is an obligation. We must do it. And the more we suffer, the more we risk our lives in doing so, even if we would rather not, because it is not a madman who is willing to be killed for martyrdom. It is quite the opposite. In a dangerous situation in the Holy Land, one goes to tell him, but perhaps it would be better for us to get, but hey, we didn't come here to get ourselves all killed. And he, Louis, looks at him and says, look, there is no one who loves life more than I do. However, for a Christian king, it is a duty. Is it clear? I am trying to express the pathos with which they lived these things. We can then say that their attitudes are very distant from ours. However, I believe we must share with our ancestors the sense that these were significant matters, important to them. Louis, therefore, is one who lives the crusade. In a moment of suffering, humiliation, and penance, he decides to go and liberate the Holy Land. On one hand, he must set up a large military and financial mechanism, find resources, deplete the state's treasury, recruit knights, find ships, and build a port specifically at Aigues-Mortes on the coast of southern France. At the same time, he embarks on a journey across his kingdom of France on foot, often barefoot, traveling from a church to a sanctuary, dressed as a pilgrim with a staff and a satchel, without any sumptuous clothing and so on. And the people are there watching him, astonished because, as I was saying, there are already some who no longer believe so much, and to see a king who believes to this extent convinces everyone that he is a saint. It is there that everyone starts to say, he's not just an ordinary person. There is a story about an Italian friar named Salimbene from Parma, a very entertaining chronicler of that time, a Franciscan who was in France, in a convent in Sens, where the general chapter of the Franciscan order was being held, and the king passes by during his journey to embark for the crusade. And Salimbene recounts, well, it was known that such a person was supposed to arrive that morning. He wanted to speak to the friars, so everyone went to meet him. This is not related to the crusade, but let's say it anyway. Salimbene says there was a particularly important friar in the convent, Friar Udrigo, who was also the Archbishop of Rouen. Therefore, to meet the king, he wanted to go with all his archbishop's vestments, including the mitre and the pastoral staff, and he took time to prepare himself. When he was ready, everyone had already left, and then I saw him rushing outside with the mitre and the pastoral staff, shouting, "Where is the king? Where is the king?" And all the others, because they were already on the road, were watching where the king was coming from, and they saw him arrive on foot with a pilgrim's staff. He then says, "I want to speak to you," and they let him enter the church, which still has a dirt floor. They want to bring him some benches, but he says, "No, we will sit on the ground," and he sits on the ground and speaks to the friars, telling them that he needs their help. And there, the more cunning begin to worry, because when the king asks the church for help, it often requires tapping into the treasury, and instead the king immediately says, no, I will go at my own expense. I am spending only my own money. The help I need is your prayers. And Salimbene, who was present, an Italian, said that all the French friars were crying. Luigi is someone who made a vow to go on a crusade. He went twice. The first time, he risked losing his life, and countless people died. The second time, he truly lost his life. The first time he was still young, he made a vow to go on a crusade because he had been very ill, and during his illness, he had visions. When he recovered from the illness, he said, "I have made a vow to go, to take the cross, and to go and liberate the tomb." Meanwhile, the Muslims have already reconquered the Holy Sepulchre, so it is again a matter of liberating it. I made this vow, and he says a very beautiful phrase. He says, "My spirit is thinking about the visions it had in delirium. It was at the point of death. My spirit has long been beyond the sea, and now this body of mine will go there." Afterward, his mother and the Bishop of Paris tried to convince him that since he made the vow in a state of delirium, it is not valid, and there is no need for him to go. And he, who has already had the cross sewn onto his garment, which was the symbol of the Crusaders, called so because they have the cross sewn onto their garments, tears the cross from his clothing, gives it to the bishop, and says, "Now give it back to me, for I want everyone to see that I am of sound mind at the moment I take it." He goes to Egypt because they have made the strategic calculation that by conquering Egypt they can disrupt the internal connections within the Muslim world, and afterwards Jerusalem will fall on its own. In fact, they land in Egypt, but they face tremendous difficulties, and in the end, they are defeated. Many died. The king is captured and must pay a large ransom. After the Muslims release the prisoners, they must turn back. It is extremely complicated and takes years. It is a tragic experience filled with diseases and epidemics, which the king endures fully with his body. There is dysentery in the camp, and the king suffers from dysentery like everyone else, often fainting. He has such severe dysentery that, as the chronicler says, at one point, they had to cut the back of his trousers to make things easier. They tell him to go to one of the galleries, to the ships where he can be safe at least. And he says, "No, my people are here. I am here, they are dying here, I will stay here too," to understand the type always. At a certain point, there are unburied corpses of Christians who have been killed in battle, no one has buried them. The king goes and says, I will bury them. He calls his friends and says, let's go bury those martyrs. They have suffered death, and we can also endure the inconvenience of burying their bodies. Do not feel disgust for these bodies because they are martyrs in paradise. In fact, everyone around him is astonished. Let it be clear, I am not describing the normal behavior of all the Crusaders. I am describing a behavior that fully embodies the ideals of the Crusaders, but which his contemporaries consider to be quite astonishing. He is, however, a complicated man, complicated with nuances. At a certain point in the camp, Armenian pilgrims, Eastern Christians, pass by as they are going to Jerusalem. They are going there with a safe conduct from the Sultan, who allows peaceful people to go to Jerusalem. It is only those who arrive armed that are fought against and generally defeated. Opening a parenthesis, the Sultan also offered Louis IX, after defeating him, to go on a pilgrimage to Jerusalem with a safe conduct. They care so much about it. We let him go. And Louis IX would really care a lot. And he torments himself. And in the end, he decides not to go. For he says, if I, who am the King of France, accept a safe conduct to go to Jerusalem and do not conquer it, but merely go to see it and then return, who else will ever try to conquer it? Everyone will think that if what I have done is enough, they will do it too. But it doesn't work that way, because he wants to conquer it. Because this kind of brother, from many points of view, seems like St. Francis in many ways. The martyrs, the corpses, being among the people who suffer. However, it may seem like a contradiction to us, but it is not, because he is a crusader. The biographers also describe him at the moment of landing, when they finally arrived in front of the beaches, and the landing boats opened. The knights began to disembark, splashing in the water, taking possession of the beach, and Louis was among them on horseback, in armor, with a golden helmet. The most beautiful knight anyone had ever seen, says one of the chroniclers. And since there are some Arabs watching the scene from afar, Louis IX cannot resist, dismounts on horseback, and alone charges with his lance against them. They struggle to hold him back, because he is the king. So as you can see, a crusader is always two things at once. One who behaves with an attitude, almost like that of a Franciscan friar, from a certain point of view, and on the other hand, a warrior who has gone there to fight. But I was telling you that there are also indeed aspects that leave us even more astonished. His self-irony and that of those around him. One of the biographers I was telling you about is someone who knew him well. A prominent French nobleman who held his orders and wrote a large book with all the anecdotes he could remember about the life of St. Louis. This gentleman is called Joinville, and Joinville says, yes, during the crusade at a certain point in the camp, these pilgrims I mentioned passed by, Armenians who were going to Jerusalem, Eastern Christians. And these Eastern Christians knew that the leader of the European Crusaders was a great saint, a holy king. They knew it, and had someone point out the tent, and they all went there, where Joinville was in front of the tent. They asked him to see the holy king. And Joinville, whom the king sees every day, knows him very well, is aware of all his flaws and weaknesses, knows that he is a saint and admires him greatly. But he also discusses with us, he even argues, more than once, Joinville enters and acts like a king. Yes, a king. Out there is a crowd of people who say they want to see the Holy King. But I still don't feel like kissing your bones. What does it mean to kiss your bones? Imagine their logic. The cult of relics, which is an obvious thing for them. The saint, in what form does one encounter the saints? Because in churches there are relics, often the bones of saints, and people kiss them, kneel and kiss the relics. This phrase, which means almost nothing to us, I don't feel like kissing your bones yet, says everything to them. You may be a saint, perhaps yes, but in the meantime, you are alive, and we hope that day is as far away as possible. And then there is also that measure of doubt, let's say, I mean the living saints, but the saints have usually been dead for a long time. And the king, John Will says, burst out laughing heartily. He was the first who did not want to go around saying, I am the saint, and have himself adored as a saint. After that, when he dies, during his second and final crusade, where many no longer wanted to accompany him, because in the meantime more years have passed, we are now in 1270, the crusading ideal really no longer attracts many people. Many who went with him the first time and saw how it ended no longer have the desire to accompany him. In fact, when he announces that he wants to depart for the kingdom of France, a certain dismay spreads at the thought. He departs anyway. Even Joinville does not go. Then he writes in the book, "Yes, I am a bit regretful. I should have gone, but what can you do after all?" He was a saint. He went, fell ill, delirium, death. Before dying in delirium, he says, we must send preachers to convert them. I know some preachers who are so good. We must send those to convert them. And one does not know if he is merely delirious or if perhaps the example of St. Francis, which has now been so long ago, begins to work even at that level. Here, we are truly at the end of the crusading ideal in the sense that it has been the real one. An ideal that managed to unite this enormous spirit of sacrifice, the immense allure they felt for those who went, along with our obvious bewilderment because our values are quite different, combined with the firm idea that one goes armed to massacre, to conquer, to subjugate, to rout. Louis IX, who on his deathbed says, I know some excellent preachers, is truly in some way the icon of the crusading ideal that is really coming to an end. It is Richard the Lionheart, then. It is Richard the Lionheart who is known, I believe, even more than Louis IX to all of us. Partly it is Walter Scott's fault, I suppose. And then after the whole saga of Robin Hood, up to the Walt Disney cartoons, it is Richard the Lionheart, who obviously pairs with the evil King John Lackland. These are figures that we all have in mind a bit. Richard the Lionheart is a brave hero, while John Lackland, his brother, is known to be a cowardly villain. Richard the Lionheart is so famous, and he was later chosen by Walter Scott as the hero of his novels, because he was one of the protagonists of the Crusades, before Louis IX. During the Third Crusade at the end of the 12th century, one of the largest and most challenging, Richard the Lionheart goes. At a time when the fortunes of the Kingdom of Jerusalem are at their lowest, everything is going very badly. Saladin has reconquered Jerusalem, and only remnants of the kingdom remain to defend, along with a few ports. A great crusade is launched, and Richard the Lionheart, King of England, departs, being the only one in that crusade capable of standing up to Saladin on the battlefield. He is the only crusader commander who defeats Saladin in open battle, after many had been defeated. The city seat, conquest, spreads terror, is seen by all in battle, not like Louis IX, who would get caught up in enthusiasm, but then fought little because he was defeated quickly. Richard the Lionheart wins, continues to win, fights. He is always among the knights, personally, with sword in hand, his armor covered in blood, and everyone looks at him and says, what a brave man! How wonderful! This is a true man. This is a true king, a true lion, lion-hearted. Now it is all true. He was a great warrior, in the sense that we know he was one of the English kings who fought the most even in Europe before departing for the crusade. He always found enemies, rebellious vassals to subdue, his brother John. The King of France. He fought his entire life. We also know a little about other things regarding Richard the Lionheart. He fought his whole life, putting himself on the line personally, and he enjoyed it very much. He was a great fighter. He killed a lot of people with his own hands. He has massacred prisoners on numerous occasions, hanged, drowned prisoners by the dozens or hundreds, both Christians and, with even greater satisfaction, Muslims in the Holy Land. He was hated by his people. Meanwhile, because he was French. How could the King of England be a Frenchman? I won't go into it because it's too complex, but he was indeed French, regardless of what Walter Scott and the novel by Ivano say. He was hated by his people because he imposed terrifying taxes. It was not John Lackland, it was Richard the Lionheart who imposed terrifying taxes to finance his wars. He was known by all as a cruel, fierce, oppressive sovereign, but a great warrior, and this pleased the people. When that great warrior then passed away, it was a relief for many. He leaves Europe to go fight the infidels. The hero is made because the Crusades are also just this. They were also conceived for this purpose. When we read the calls to the Crusades from Urban II onwards, or the treatises on the Crusades, stating that it is mandatory for kings, princes, and knights to go on crusade, this is precisely what the clergy, who are the intellectuals of that time, think. These kings and knightly princes who command, collect taxes, administer justice, and hang wrongdoers do so with harshness and violence. They are all armed, the power is entirely military, and they continuously fight among themselves, and they will all go to hell. Of course, because they all have blood on their hands. And if this violence of theirs, the clerics who are the intellectuals of the Middle Ages think, if this violence of the powerful and the rich could be channeled towards a good end, if we could send them to the Holy Land to fight the enemies of God, to defend Christianity over there, this is also the crusade. And so it is perfectly fine. Someone who has blood on their hands at home and would go to hell when they do the same thing overseas is instead considered a hero. And Richard the Lionheart remains one of the great heroes of the West of Europe. Despite all those things we have mentioned, why is he a great hero? Because he instilled terrible fear in the Muslims. The anecdotes that circulate in medieval literature about Richard the Lionheart are of this kind. Many writers recount this. The Saracens were so afraid of King Richard that Muslim mothers, to calm their crying children, would say, "Look, King Richard is coming." After that, I am indeed getting ready to conclude. What seems important for us to understand is that many generations of our ancestors shared this block of ideas, values, and ideals that, to our eyes, may seem partly extravagant, yet fascinating, perhaps. In part, however, they do not seem ideal at all. For them, it was not a contradiction. For a long time before they began to tire and stop believing, Westerners believed it was right to seek martyrdom, that it was right to follow Christ in the footsteps of the Passion, to suffer, to risk death, killing, to take from the enemies of God something that was considered so precious, the holy places, the tomb, knowing perfectly well that if in doing this one became wealthy, conquered new lands, new empires, and became kings or princes, this was not a contradiction. Rather, it was the rightful reward. And thus, even more of a hero is he who went and succeeded in becoming king, like Godfrey of Bouillon. And I would like to conclude by evoking a specific situation, that of a family of princes, these territorial princes that I have mentioned so often, who are the ones that benefited the most from these extraordinary opportunities to save their souls while simultaneously living a great adventure with astonishing prospects for success. In the time of Richard the Lionheart, which is also the time of Frederick Barbarossa, the Battle of Legnano, and the Lombard League, there was among others a lineage of princes in Italy, the Marquesses of Monferrato, from my area in Piedmont. They were among those who had much to lose with the growth of the citizen communes, and the defeat of the emperor, because as the communes grow, there is less space for princes, for the rural world, and for the nobles of the countryside. During the years of Legnano, the Marquess of Monferrato, William the Elder, who has 4 sons, which would already be too many even if things were going well, struggles to envision a future for them in a world where the emperor has been defeated and the cities are triumphant. He begins to think that, for someone of his rank, there is a way out, and this way out is offered from overseas. It is as if the Crusades had opened a horizon that did not exist before or was closed, and now, at least for the powerful, at least for the princes, we know much less about the poor and the reasons they set out. But certainly for princes, it is as if the world has suddenly doubled. Here things are going poorly, but there are extraordinary prospects, especially for a prince who has beautiful children, tall, blonde, and strong. What was happening at that moment in the kingdom of Jerusalem? Saladin was just beginning his reconquest. The horizon was already becoming quite dark. And it was all the more dark because the king of Jerusalem, the successor of Godfrey of Bouillon, was a 15-year-old boy suffering from leprosy. Baldwin IV, king of Jerusalem, suffering from leprosy, which was a disease that at the time was believed to be much worse than it actually is, and for which there was no known cure. It was believed to be a terribly contagious disease, which it seems it was not, but there was certainly a deep horror of leprosy, and in any case it was not curable. Yet he was the king. The crown had come to him by hereditary right, even though it was clear that within a few years he would be left paralyzed and blind. And then he would die. And certainly it was unthinkable that a noble girl could be found to marry him and give him an heir. But the king had 2 sisters, and thus it was evident to everyone that the husbands of those sisters could be candidates to govern the kingdom of Jerusalem. And naturally, the barons of the kingdom were all lined up to see who would prevail and manage to win the hand of one of these princesses. But Baldwin IV, who at 15 years old seemed to be a very capable young king, does not trust the barons of the kingdom. He prefers a husband for one of his sisters who comes from outside and can guarantee support, connections, and alliances on the continent. Without those, the kingdom of Jerusalem would not be able to survive. The Marquis of Monferrato, William, sends his son, who is also named William and nicknamed Longsword, to marry Sibylla, the sister of King Leprosy. The young William arrives. The chroniclers describe him as very handsome, tall, and blonde. Medieval knights are all tall and blonde because this was their ideal. It is also true that the Marquesses of Monferrato had German roots through marriage. He is very liked, marries the girl, and quickly gets her pregnant. Meanwhile, he feasts and drinks a lot, as the chroniclers say. But this is normal because a man must prove he is a man. Then he begins to waste away, falls ill, and dies within 3 months. Naturally, the barons from overseas all start looking at each other to see who has pulled the poison from the secret cupboards. But nothing is ever discovered. Moreover, many of these young blonde individuals who arrive from Europe die suddenly as soon as they arrive. They are not accustomed to those climates. Now the girl is pregnant, so an heir will be born. In fact, he will be Baldwin V of Montferrat, king of Jerusalem, but he has yet to be born. And the young leprous king, who is still able to ride at that moment and fight against Saladin, manages to hold his ground against Saladin in a battle. However, he is rapidly deteriorating. Another husband is needed for one of these sisters, specifically the one who has been widowed and is the eldest. Thus she holds more importance. And this time, another European contender, Guy of Lusignan, arrives from France, and he marries her. Guy of Lusignan also comes from outside, so the local barons are not happy at all, but they still cannot poison him. Guy of Lusignan must show that he is a real man, of course. Therefore, he decides to confront Saladin and stop this progressive reconquest that is strangling the kingdom. He gathers the army, all the members of the Order of the Templars, the Order of the Hospital, all the barons with their knights and vassals. He sets out to confront Saladin, who has been reported somewhere in Galilee. They cross Galilee in the height of summer, an arid area. They are about to arrive at the Lake of Tiberias, the one where Jesus walked on water, where they will finally have something to drink before Saladin arrives and attacks them, surrounding them without water. They remain there. The next day, everyone surrenders. Saladin has the heads of those who had wronged him in the past cut off, as well as those he disliked the most, such as the Order of the Templars, whom he considered fanatics. He negotiates a ransom with the others. Among others, there is also William of Montferrat, the old man, the grandfather of the child who is about to be born, or who perhaps has already been born in these months. He has come to take care of the inheritance, evidently. He remains a prisoner for a while, and no one pays a ransom for him. However, many are freed. Saladin has annihilated the army of Jerusalem and is able to reconquer the entire kingdom. He advances, and within a few weeks occupies almost the entire kingdom, taking Jerusalem, which will never again fall into Christian hands. Only one port remains, St. John of Acre, where the last armed Christians have taken refuge. At that precise moment, another son of Marquis William arrives on the shores of the Holy Land. His name is Corrado. He also sought fortune in the east, in Constantinople, where he married a Byzantine princess. He suppressed a conspiracy on behalf of the emperor, but then he realized that there was a risk of being poisoned if he stayed there too long, so he set off for the Holy Land. Without knowing anything about what had happened, the defeat of the army, or the fact that Saladin had reconquered everything. Corrado arrives by ship at a port he believes is in Christian hands. But as he enters the harbor, he sees Muslim sentinels on the dock. Then there is this dialogue that is astonishing to us, but which the chroniclers recount as something completely obvious. Corrado says, "We do not know in which language he had the interpreter. He hides the fact that he is a prince." Because those who had come to lend a hand in the Holy Land would have been arrested otherwise. And he says, "No, we are Christian merchants. We have come to trade. We have learned that Saladin has conquered everything, and confident in his protection, we come to trade." And the guards don't flinch. The situation is absolutely normal. Merchants come and trade and do business anyway, always, and no one disturbs them. Therefore they take to the sea again, sail, and go, to land in the only city that they have learned is still in Christian hands, which is St. John of Acre. And there, of course, the arrival of Conrad of Montferrat, who is already a well-known fighter, a renowned knight, is welcomed with enthusiasm. He takes on the task of defending the city, gathers the few available forces, and defends the city. Saladin arrives and besieges it, but he is unable to take it. In the end, Saladin tries to convince Corrado to surrender, bringing out his father, the old Marquis William, who is still a prisoner, and tells him that if he does not give up the city, he will condemn his father to death. And Corrado gives one of those answers that are naturally recounted in all the markets of the West for generations, and that spark enthusiasm. He says, "But my father has already lived a very long time." At this point, Saladin finds that these people truly free the Marquis and let it go. Finally, Saladin has a stroke of genius. He finds a way to rid himself of Conrad, who in the meantime has accomplished other feats, having destroyed the only Egyptian fleet that Saladin had painstakingly managed to establish. However, Conrad has the Genoese and Pisan galleys, and thus he defeats the Muslim ships. Saladin can no longer take it, but then he has a stroke of genius. He still has in his hands King Guy of Lusignan, the one who married Sibylla and led the army to disaster, and who is hated by all. He frees him for free. Guy of Lusignan goes to knock on the gates of Tyre and says, "I am the king. Now, Conrad, cede power to me." And Conrad, of course, once again refuses from the ramparts. He tells him, "You have led the army to ruin. You have gambled away the crown. You have no more rights." However, after that, factions begin to form. There are those who would actually like Guy of Lusignan to return, and there are those who want Conrad. From Europe, the true kings, a bit tired of these puppets in the Holy Land, decide that it is time to intervene. Richard the Lionheart sets out, for example, and other kings depart as well. They fight for a while. Richard the Lionheart gains great victories, but they are futile, and they fail to recapture Jerusalem. Finally, they all get tired and leave, with only Conrad remaining. The barons gather in the end, and decide that he is the only one worthy of being king of Jerusalem, while waiting for his little nephew, the child Baldwin, to grow up. There is an agreement among all for Conrad to be crowned king of Jerusalem. The next day, after lunch, Conrad goes out into the street. 2 assassins confront him, stab him, and leave him dead on the ground. And he will never become king of Jerusalem. Now, why am I telling you this story? Because I believe we must first have an idea of what the thoughts, fantasies, and images were that our ancestors had in mind before we engage in discussions about concepts like holy war or jihad, which I think will resonate more with our current problems. And they had this in mind. When they spoke of crusades, they certainly thought of the salvation of the soul, the passion of Christ, the ideal, the dream of going to touch the holy sepulchre with their own hands. And at the same time they thought of this world where such things could happen, where one could leave and become king. Another brother of Conrad, Boniface, but I won't tell you about him, because it's too long, will even become the emperor of Constantinople, after setting out on a crusade. And his followers will be somewhat regretful, because Constantinople was not really the objective of the crusade, to be honest. It was a Christian empire. They have conquered it, but they do not resist. The songs of their troubadours are full of enthusiasm for the empire we have conquered and we have all become kings and princes. Here, this immense greed translates into an effort, a desire to conquer, to take, to grab, to massacre, while putting oneself physically at risk, risking one's skin. It is certain that one is doing something blessed by God. This is, I believe, the essence of the phenomenon of the Crusades. In short, something that I believe may be very distant for us, but my job is precisely to try to tell and understand a bit of what our ancestors had that was very different from what we are today. Thank you. Good evening. So, this meeting tonight will perhaps be a little more demanding than yesterday's, and I apologize for that. In the sense that yesterday, we established some overall parameters to orient ourselves in a complicated phenomenon like the Crusades, and then we also tried to narrate, which is, after all, the mandate I was given to narrate the Crusades. And tomorrow we will tell a lot again, today. What I will try to do is, as you already know, a little more complex perhaps, because it involves analyzing two parallel aspects, indeed reflecting one in the other of the Crusades phenomenon. That is the birth of the idea of holy war in Christian culture, and the birth and then especially the evolution of the concept of jihad in Islamic culture. As you understand the risk of getting me into trouble, these are quite delicate matters, so I hope you will excuse me for making a preamble. And the premise is this. I will happen to use references to the sacred texts of the major religions, of course. I will make references to the Old Testament. Very few, perhaps, to the New Testament. And I will make references to the Quran. These are texts that believers naturally consider to be the word of God, the word of the Lord, as it is said in the Catholic liturgy, things dictated by God to men through the prophets. I will naturally touch upon these texts regardless of whether one should believe in them as the words of the Lord. Among other things, opinions differ in the sense that the Old Testament, as you may know, is considered the word of the Lord by all the major religions. The Old Testament is considered the voice of God speaking to the prophets by Jews, Christians, and also by Muslims, since the Quran is largely rooted in the Old Testament. The New Testament is considered the word of God only by Christians, but not by Jews or Muslims. The Quran is considered the word of God by Muslims, but not by Jews or Christians. Now, I will address these texts from a historical perspective, of course. Everyone in their heart can know whether they believe or not that this is the word of a Creator God. But I think we can all agree that the Old Testament, the New Testament, and the Quran were written at a certain historical moment by men, who felt them being dictated in their minds, and who wrote them in the words of their language and their time. And I also believe that we can all agree that these texts have continued over the centuries and millennia to influence the way of thinking and acting of the faithful of the major monotheistic religions, though not always in the same way. Here, if I had to summarize in one sentence what I will try to show tonight, it is that the set of precepts or examples contained in the sacred texts of a religion has, depending on historical moments, been interpreted in very different ways, either taken literally or interpreted allegorically, read and reread and repeated with great insistence, or instead set aside and almost forgotten. Here, this is a historical dimension of the great religions and their relationship with the sacred texts that I believe is very important for us to keep in mind. Well, excuse me for this boring preamble. Let's get to the point. Let's talk about Christians and holy war. The starting point is that the early Christians absolutely rejected the idea that one could go to war, that one could be a soldier as a profession, and that one could therefore have a profession that inevitably sooner or later forces you to kill. For the early Christians, and I am referring to the Christians of the early centuries, the centuries of persecutions and the catacombs, the refusal of military service was a matter of honor, a firm point of their faith. And it is one of the reasons, among others, why they were persecuted. The great persecutions that repeatedly affected Christians in the Roman imperial world, and more generally the distrust of the imperial government towards these people, is always perceived, even with the emperors, whom we may admire more, Trajan and Marcus Aurelius, but who, when it comes to Christians, display an attitude of surprising distrust and preconceived contempt. This is largely due to the subversive effect of this refusal of military service. To be honest, let's open a very small parenthesis. There was also another reason, which is essentially two. The other reason is that in the empire, great emphasis was placed on the divinity of the emperor, and the necessity for all good citizens to recognize the emperor as a deity by making sacrifices for him. This was, so to speak, a common minimum denominator. One could worship the gods they wanted at home, but as a citizen of the Roman Empire, they had to make a public sacrifice to the emperor. The Christians and the Jews, but the Jews are a special case, a small people that does not make converts, who stay in their own country or in their small communities. The Jews and Christians reject this idea, and while some compromises can be reached with the Jews, the Christians, who are growing and spreading into increasingly larger communities, make converts, and thus provoke a great deal of fear. The perhaps main reason, to be honest, for the harshest persecutions can be seen in the records of the persecutions, in the records of the trials. It is precisely this. You can see the procurators who have the Christian in front of them and say, "But just make this sacrifice." "I cannot." "But what does it cost you?" "It's just a gesture." It's a gesture of a good citizen. "You can believe whatever you want, do it." "I can't." "Look, I have to put you to death." "I can't." "Do it." "No." And the procurators condemn to death. But the other reason, which is quite lengthy, but let's conclude, is that Christians firmly refuse military service. And this is a subversive attitude in the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire is based on war, especially in the late Empire. Diocletian, for example, one of the great persecutors of Christians, is also the one who reinstates mandatory military service, which had almost disappeared before. He imposes very strict laws stating that the sons of soldiers must become soldiers, because this way of solidifying society, where everyone follows in their father's profession, is perceived as the only way to stem the collapse and dissolution of the empire. So, in that empire full of people who are legally obligated to be soldiers, this religion spreads that instead says, "No, you cannot be a soldier." And these ideas spread among the soldiers, leading to soldiers and officers resigning. And yet they cannot resign, it is too convenient. And they go to martyrdom. Many of the so-called military saints, who are part of the pantheon of Christian saints, such as Saint Sebastian and many others, are soldiers who were martyred because they wanted to leave military service. Then the paradox, if we may say so, is that in other times they often became patrons of regiments or similar things as military saints depicted with weapons. But they went to their deaths and became saints because they believed that their religion prohibited them from being soldiers. Well, this extremist attitude, however, changes overnight when the persecutions cease and the Roman Empire recognizes the Christian religion. You all know it is with Constantine at the beginning of the 4th century, at the moment when the emperor officially declares that Christians are good subjects like others. They are free to practice their faith as they wish, and soon it begins to be understood that they are also a bit more equal than others because the emperor appreciates them, favors them, and the emperor himself is close to their positions. After Constantine, all the emperors will be Christians except for one, Julian, who for good reason the Christians called Julian the Apostate, meaning the one who renounced the faith. In this empire, which has been officially Christian since Constantine, the Christians suddenly change their attitude. There are acts of council that say, "No, now that the emperor is Christian, we cannot refuse to help him when he needs it. Therefore, if the emperor needs soldiers, we must provide them." It is no longer wrong for a Christian to be a soldier for the Christian emperor. Is it possible to go to war? Yes, A debate begins that will last a long time, of which we will touch on some stages. But there is no glorification of war. Rather, it starts to be reasoned that, if commanded by a legitimate sovereign, and therefore Christian, Christians can indeed go to war. From the texts of these centuries, of these early centuries, we understand that the problem is significant and not easily resolved. We understand that Christians are questioning and their consciences are uncertain. There is an extraordinary text by St. Augustine on this. Beginning of the 5th century, we are now 100 years after Constantine. It should be a problem resolved. The empire is officially Christian, everyone is Christian, the army is full of Christian soldiers, and yet at that time a letter arrives for Constantine from an officer of the Roman imperial army, who tells him, "Look, I am not at peace, I am tormented, because I do not understand if this profession of mine is compatible with the fact that I am a Christian." And Augustine gives a contradictory answer. That is, he provides a response in which we see his reasoning as if he were speaking. Sometimes we do this, speaking out loud, to clarify our thoughts. He writes and says, it begins like this. "One cannot think that God is pleased with those who serve in the military and bear arms." The first thing that comes to his mind is still that so strong is the idea that there is the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill," and therefore weapons cannot be carried. However, Augustine immediately realizes that this is a nice theorization, but the world is going in another direction. And fortunately, so to speak, the sacred texts of his religion also provide him with elements to reconsider the problem. In fact, as he continues right after in the second sentence of this letter from St. Augustine, even David bore arms, King David. You see that the Old Testament comes up immediately. In the New Testament, it would have been more difficult. It is true that Jesus at one point says he did not come to bring peace but a sword, yet the discussion about what he really meant has not ceased. In the Old Testament, it is much easier. The kings of the Jews go to war and massacre their enemies, and it is God who told them to do so. Even David bore arms, along with many other righteous men of that time. After that, it is Constantine and unconstantine to God. He has Constantine and to God. He has Constantine and unconstantine to God. Augustine goes on to reason about this theme and ends with a solution. That is the least bad we have found as humans so far, because even today, I believe it is the least bad that can be said. In certain cases, it is necessary. War is waged to achieve peace. It should be noted that Augustine, I pause for a moment on him because he is one of the founders of Christian thought, continued to reflect, to question, and to grapple with this issue. And in his later works, clearer compositions emerge. It almost seems that at a certain point he grew tired of these eternal discussions. There is a work in which he says, "But what is there to blame in war, killing men who one day will have to die?" This is a reproach unworthy of religious men, where it is evident that Augustine, who was still an ancient intellectual, tends to overlay the idea of the philosopher, who should not be influenced by certain considerations, with that of the ecclesiastic, the theologian. And then he continues and clarifies the thought that we have already mentioned earlier. I cite, "Sometimes it is necessary for the good to wage war against the violent by command of God and the government of Egypt, compelled by the situation, in order to maintain order. Therefore, waging war can be legitimate. We are, of course, far from saying that it is a good thing. We are in positions that say, yes, it pains us, it torments us, it entangles us, but we cannot fail to recognize that in this world it may be necessary to do it. This does not mean that one can cheerfully kill in war, because there is this very curious contradiction. For me, who has been studying these matters for a long time, it is still difficult to understand in practice how they managed. Essentially, throughout the early Middle Ages, up until the year 1000, almost until the First Crusade, the Christian Church states that war is legitimate if it is required by a legitimate sovereign. However, killing in war is still a sin and requires confession and penance. Now keep in mind that in the first millennium, Christianity gave confession and penance a very different character from that which it later assumed. At that time, for example, confession was public. There was no confessional where I secretly confessed my sins to the priest. Confession was public. It took place in front of the community, and there was a strong emphasis on the fact that when you have sinned, in order to be welcomed back into the community of the faithful, you must also perform a public penance. Penance that can be a period of fasting and things of that nature. The Christian culture of the first millennium is entirely woven with reflections on which penances should be given for which sins and what the gravest offenses are. Manuals are written, and we know these things, fortunately, because they wrote manuals. Of the manuals for confessors that stated, in short, depending on the sin, what penance should be given. And in these manuals we see the confessors of the early Middle Ages, during the time of the barbarian invasions, then Charlemagne, and up until the year 1000, who question and do not all share the same opinions. Some say, yes, killing in war is certainly a sin, as it is written, do not kill, but it is not a grave sin. There are mitigating circumstances. So, those who kill in war must do penance, of course, but for example, 3 days of fasting. Other confessors believe that the matter is more serious, and there are manuals that state that anyone who has killed, even for a just cause, cannot go to church, for example, for a certain period. They must stay away from sacred rites, from Mass and from communion, for quite some time. And then there are also those more modern, one might say, who argue that if the war is legitimate, then killing in war cannot be a sin. It is not a sin. So the Church, and I am talking about the Western Church, the Latin Catholic Church, is divided. Until the year 1000, up to the time of the First Crusade, there are episodes in which battles are celebrated with gratitude because almost no one was killed there. Behold, the victors were moderate. They did not kill the fleeing enemies, and then with a few days of penance, in short, the matter was concluded beautifully. I would like to emphasize, although I know very little about it, that the Greek Church, which we call the Orthodox Church, the Eastern Church, has increasingly looser and weaker relations with the Latin Catholic Church and the papacy over the centuries, while the Greek Church remains much more rigid. The Greek Church continues to believe that killing in war, even if it may be legitimate, is still a grave sin. For example, it is mentioned that there are 3 years of exclusion from Mass and communion for those who are killed in war. But what I would like to emphasize to conclude this aspect is that we have now arrived at the eve of the First Crusade. Beyond the contradictions and the tangle that this problem evidently represents, there is officially a system in which killing in any war, at best, is not considered a grave sin. However, it is still required that penance be performed. And this is the aspect that is difficult for us to imagine, because from the other point of view, it is a warrior society. Charlemagne waged war every year against the pagans to expand the Christian faith, and, in some way, one must imagine that when they returned from war, those who knew they had truly stained their hands with blood still had to perform purifying rites. If we want, we can resolve it by thinking that in many religions, purifying rites are required, even for things that are not sins. The female cycle, for example, requires that a woman who has experienced it must purify herself before she can return to religious rites. This happens in various contexts, and so one might think that for our ancestors of the early Middle Ages, those killed in war are impure. However, it may not be a sin, but they are still considered impure and must do penance. Oh, you understand at this point what a turning point the First Crusade represents, with the attitude that we perhaps only hinted at yesterday, but which you more or less already know, and we will clarify better now, of those who participate in the crusade, and who are convinced from the very beginning that not only is the crusade a war that is not merely legitimate, but it is a holy war. It is a war that is not only permitted, but is even deemed necessary and is beautiful. And secondly, those who go there quickly become convinced that killing enemies in a war like that does not constitute any sin at all. Rather, it is something that will guarantee you paradise. Here, the turning point, as you can see, is truly dramatic. There is indeed a break in the history of Christianity and the West. These are moments worth pausing to reflect on. It is a turning point, which is very curious, that seems almost imposed from below by the collective mentality. Because at the beginning, the Church, when it calls for the crusade, indeed moves very much in this direction, but with some precautions. Pope Urban II, when he begins to preach in 1095, asking Christians to take up arms and march against the Turks to conquer Jerusalem, says, and this is already significant, let it be clear, for all those who depart, if they encounter death on the journey or in battle against the infidels, there will be immediate remission of sins, that I grant by the authority, that God concedes to me. As you can see, on one hand, it is a lot. The Pope is taking on a very big responsibility. He is taking on the responsibility of declaring who participates in this endeavor. And by the mere fact of participating, if they die, they will have the remission of sins. However, for those who understand the subtleties of theologians, and these were people who had studied and measured their words, the remission of sins is not everything. The remission of sins means that you have committed sins, and how. But I, the Pope, with my authority, can perform this extraordinary act of telling you that even if you have killed, and thus committed a mortal sin, you will not face the consequences. I, the Pope, take on the responsibility of saying that you will be forgiven for this. Which, by the way, does not imply that one won't spend 100,000 years in purgatory for having killed. The remission of sins only means, well, it's like when one confesses, essentially. There the problem is that you die in war, and there is no time to confess. What happens? People raise this issue, and the Pope says not to worry, even if you don't have time to confess. It's as if you had done it. But he is not saying in any way, do not commit sin. The difference is too subtle. I don't know for us. Certainly for those who set out for the crusade, it becomes clear that the understanding is too subtle, because instead, the attitude of those who go, as we can judge from the chroniclers who speak of them, who tell us about their behavior. And we also have some written texts from the Crusaders. There is already a brief history in Latin written, clearly by a knight regarding the First Crusade. It was a rare case, a knight who could write, who knew Latin. There was someone like that, and he speaks to us in the first person. He is a true crusader, so to speak, who recounts things as he saw them. Here, these people immediately convince themselves that since they are undertaking this enormous task, responding to the call of Pope Urban II, leaving everything behind, risking their lives, following the path of Christ towards passion, and imitating the ancient martyrs, because this is also very strong in the mentality of the Crusaders. There are once again the martyrs. For 700 years, except for rare occasions, it has been impossible to be martyred. Just a few monks who went to convert the Vikings. Now, however, it becomes possible for anyone to choose to die as a martyr. One only needs to be killed by the pagans in an attempt to conquer and liberate, as they say, the Holy Sepulchre. And so they quickly convince themselves, far from the remission of sins, the base is convinced that they are doing something commendable, and that killing the pagans is a commendable act. Because those who fight are martyrs. Between the moment you kill and the moment you are killed, I will then quote a text by Saint Bernard that is very clear on this. There is little difference after all. They are two sides of the same coin, anyway, of a martyrdom. This mentality is also very well reflected in the literary texts of the time of the First Crusade. You know it from school memories. It is also the period when the first literatures in the vernacular begin to emerge, the first songs of troubadours, the first epic songs, the Song of Orlando, the Chanson de Roland, and so on. There, in the Song of Roland, the war against the pagans is staged, all, transformed into a fairy tale fabulous dimension. However, there are some very clear fixed points. We recount the deeds back of the valiant Christians who fought against the pagans, and I quote from memory the Chanson de Roland, "The pagans are wrong and the Christians are right," end quote, which is indeed a line from the song. And when the warriors of Orlando, the rear guard of Charlemagne, are massacred by the pagans at Roncesvalles, they know and say that they are going to face martyrdom. And facing martyrdom means being certain of going to paradise, of course, even if one is dying with a blood-covered sword in hand. I quote again from the Song of Orlando. Thus spoke Orlando. "Here we shall suffer martyrdom, but he will be a coward who does not sell himself dearly. Strike, gentlemen, with your shining swords." It is therefore evident that a mental short circuit has occurred in the mindset of the Crusaders. I, who am risking my life and going to martyrdom, am a martyr, and as a martyr, I am certain that I will go to paradise, and it is clear that I will go to paradise even if I have done so by killing infidels. There is no room for subtlety at this point. If we want, we can add a small appendix. One of the unpleasant things about the Crusades, which makes it a bit difficult for us to empathize with the people who participated, even though we see the enthusiasm with which they went and end up finding them likable anyway. One of the unpleasant aspects, as many of you may know, is that it is precisely during the First Crusade that the first outbreaks of violence against Jews in the West occur. The Jewish communities that had lived in the West for many centuries were more or less discriminated against. But not too much, to be honest. There were no ghettos, no yellow stars to wear on their clothes, or anything like that. Behold, these Jewish communities are systematically attacked with destruction and extermination by the crowds of crusaders moving towards the Holy Land. Immediately, as the first bands of crusaders gather between northern France and Germany in the Rhineland, they encounter the Jewish communities in the major cities of the Rhineland, in Mainz and Speyer, and they attack and massacre them. And it is an uninterrupted trail of aggression and extermination of Jews throughout the journey of the Crusaders. After that, they arrive in the Balkans, and in the Balkans they begin to meet even stranger people. Here I refer to the account of that anonymous knight I mentioned earlier, a significant story of a crusader who participated in the First Crusade from the ground level, in short, among the masses. This recounts that at a certain point in the Balkans they came across a fortified town and were told that Manichaeans lived in that town. And who are these Manichaeans? What kind of beasts are they? Well, they are people who do not believe in God. Rather, they believe that there are two gods, and that the world was created by an evil god. Heretics, then? Yes. Heretics. In fact, open parenthesis, we know that this old Manichaean religion had left traces in the Balkans. There had been communities since the time of late antiquity of Manichaeans. For those coming from France or southern Italy, like many Normans, this people have never been heard of. But as soon as they are told what kind of beasts these are, the reaction is immediate. Let's go and massacre them all. And indeed they attack the town, besiege it, and exterminate the entire population. Absolutely convinced that they are doing what they set out to do, namely, exterminating the enemies of God. And if you want, we can connect this back and close this parenthesis to a point I made yesterday about the fact that at a certain point the papacy will start to think that perhaps the crusade can also be proclaimed against enemies other than Muslims and also with objectives different from the conquest of Jerusalem. Because if we have enemies of God even at home, it is not clear why we should not use the crusade against them. The papacy would never dream of unleashing the crusaders against the Jews. The issue is very complex, but certainly the papacy is not responsible for that. However, it is responsible against heretics. As you know, when the Cathar heresy gains particular ground in southern France, to the point that the church becomes truly frightened, a crusade is declared to exterminate these Cathars or Albigensians as they were called. Closing the parentheses, what I wanted to be evident is the profound change in mentality that takes place. And let us also add that the church, in the face of this reaction from public opinion and this deep conviction of the masses, ultimately gives up trying to restrain it. The idea that those who die during the Crusades go directly to paradise no matter what they have done, and that therefore killing non-believers is still a good thing that brings you to paradise, is an idea that can no longer be questioned. So much so that, at a certain point in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, communities arise. We are just after the First Crusade. Follow me. The First Crusade was successful. In 1099, Jerusalem was conquered. A vast territory that includes the entire current Middle East was taken, transformed into a Christian kingdom. With Muslims all around, very furious and determined to reclaim these territories for the true faith and drive the invaders back into the sea. Therefore, the kingdom must be defended. Therefore, volunteers continuously arrive from Europe who come to fight because they have vowed to spend a year in the Holy Land and defend the cause. And there are also people who come and stay. Many soldiers, knights, and people who know how to fight come and decide. He decides that perhaps he has many sins to atone for, and that from now on he will dedicate himself to a cause where he can continue to fight, which is the only thing he knows how to do, but he saves his soul, which is something they care about, because they believe very deeply in the existence of the soul, paradise and hell, and they are there, waiting for you. Now, among the knights who come to the Holy Land to lend a hand, at a certain point, the idea is born. Let's found, we would say, an association. To fight a section of warriors that fights against the Muslims with statutes, rules. But how do they reason? They live in a civilization deeply infused with religious values, so it does not occur to them to found an association. Perhaps if they had been those Genoese merchants transporting them across the Mediterranean, the Genoese merchants might have thought of it. But the French knights, who are all French at the beginning, when they arrive there, do not found an association. They think of founding a religious order. We dedicate ourselves to religious life, but not like the monks at home, who stay shut in the monastery all the time praying, and who must have studied to do so. We are knights, people who have learned to ride and fight since the age of 7 or 8. This is what we know how to do. However, we want to dedicate ourselves to God. We establish a religious community, taking vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience to our superiors. And the statute of this community, the purpose for which it exists, will be to fight against the infidels and to defend Jerusalem. They establish this association, look for a headquarters, find the temple, the ancient temple of Jerusalem, find some spaces there, and call themselves the Knights of the Temple, that is, the Knights Templar, which we have all heard of. Thus the Knights Templar are born as a brotherhood of knights, laymen, mostly illiterate, who however want to be monks, but monks of a very particular kind. Now, as you can see, the very fact that such an idea can emerge demonstrates the kind of climate we are in. Because the monks, all the monks I have encountered while studying the Middle Ages up to that moment, are people who flee with extreme horror from violence, just as they do from sex, physical pleasures, and so on. They are convinced, all the monks who have existed until then, that anyone who lives wearing armor and wielding weapons ends up straight in hell. In fact, the monks torment themselves quite a bit because this also means that their fathers and brothers are all in hell, yet they are convinced of it nonetheless. Here, you see how the mentality of many, though not all, has changed. We will see this shortly. The mentality of many has shifted so much that it becomes possible to think about being a monk and fighting at the same time. But as I was saying, not everyone has already been driven there. When the word spreads that this brotherhood has been formed and that they are asking to be officially recognized as a religious order, the reaction of the church is extremely perplexed. There are many who say, but these and those are brainwashed. It is not even conceivable that one could claim to be a monk. You are a knight. You fight the infidels. That's fine. We told you it's a good thing. However, there is a huge difference between thinking that you can be monks and the reality. For several years, the status of the Knights Templar remains uncertain, and a controversy rages. This is already a Christian world of the 12th century that is becoming more complex. There are more schools, more books are being written, discussions are taking place, and there was a lot of debate during the time of the investiture struggle, papacy and empire. It is a world in which discussions are prevalent. It is also discussed whether this idea of the Knights Templar is legitimate or, if it is, a distortion, a perversion. The situation remains in balance until one of the most famous religious figures of the time intervenes, Saint Bernard. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux, if you want to say it in Italian, who is the leader at that moment, not the founder, but the leader of the most militant order, the most militant monastic order that exists at that time, the Cistercians. The Cistercians are Benedictines, who interpret the Benedictine rule in a very austere and demanding manner, placing great emphasis on the harshness of life, penance and work. Saint Bernard is an intellectual known throughout the Catholic world and all of Latin Europe. He is extremely famous, his treatises are well known, and when he speaks on a subject, he is listened to. He is an extremely aggressive man who has obtained great privileges for his order and has fought fiercely against certain opponents. He is the one who tried in every way to have Belardo and the early philosophers of Paris imprisoned, as they began to reason too much about religious faith instead of being satisfied with mysticism. Thus, I am sketching out in a few words an extremely important, imposing, and listen-to-man of his time. Saint Bernard decides to intervene in this controversy regarding the Knights Templar, and concludes that the Templars are a good thing. They are right. For the times we are living in, and naturally Saint Bernard is also one who at a certain point says, even this our world has its knights, and not a few. So the times we are living in are what they are, but we must face them. And for the times we are living in, these Templars who want to fight against the enemies of God are much better than all those knights we see around us, who fight among themselves, fight to plunder, to enrich themselves, to oppress the poor. These are much better. And so, this new cavalry must be supported, promoted. Do they want to be monks? Let them be. He guarantees them that they will go to paradise if they fight. He writes a treatise, The Praise of the New Chivalry, which is intended to affirm the legitimacy and beauty of the ideal of the Knights Templar. I will quote a few sentences. Just to conclude the discussion on the Christian Holy War, because at this point it is quite evident the type of attitude that was created with the First Crusade, and that lasted for a long time, even though through discussions of many kinds. However, let's conclude by reading Saint Bernard. The Knights of Christ are the Knights Templar. They confidently fight the battles of the Lord, without fear and without sin when they kill the enemy. 50 years earlier, he had not said this, of course, Urbano II, now instead without sin. Death given or received, you see, is the same thing. Death given or received for Christ involves no sin, and indeed merits great glory. The Templar graciously accepts the death of the enemy as a form of atonement, and is even more willing to give himself when he falls in battle. With serenity he kills, with serenity he dies, and if he kills, he renders a service to Christ. When he is killed, it should not be said that he is dead, but that he has achieved his purpose. From the death of the pagan, the Christian draws glory, for Christ is glorified. But when the Christian dies, then divine generosity shines even more brightly, for the king calls the knight to himself to grant him the reward. Well, let's move on now, perhaps more quickly, because time has passed, but it would deserve a moment of pause to the other side of the coin, because these people found something to sink their teeth into, of course. The concept of jihad is one that is present in various passages of the Quran, not without contradictions. The Quran is a book rich in contradictions, as some may know. There are even verses that are officially abrogated by subsequent verses, for example. But let's leave that aside. In fact, the concept of jihad, if one looks closely, emerges quite clearly from the various allusions that the Quran makes to this theme. Jihad is actually just a part of an overall expression that sounds something like jihad fi sabilillah, and means fighting in the way of God. I don't stop, because it is often discussed. Franco Cardini often talks about it. For example, some may have heard him about the fact that translating jihad as fighting can be questionable. That perhaps in addition to fighting, there is a broader meaning of striving, giving one's all. I won't dwell on this, also because I am not a specialist, and in any case, the meaning of fighting, which is what interests us here, emerges from various passages of the Quran. I would just mention one thing. Fighting in the way of God. While preparing for these meetings, I went back to reread some Crusader texts, and was struck by the famous anonymous knight that I have already mentioned several times, which is a beautiful text, showing how this Crusader fundamentally received the preaching of Urban II. At the beginning of his work, this Crusader, whom I will quote for the last time before we talk about Muslims, wrote that Urban II told the faithful that anyone who wanted to save their soul should not hesitate to humbly embark on the path of the Lord. There is something common in the mindset of these people on both sides who strongly feel this call to follow, to embark on a path. It is not, of course, the Camino de Santiago of Professor Lodi Freddy, but to embark on a path on which the faithful must march, and run the risk of dying, of course. I had never seen this parallel before. It struck me while I was preparing for this meeting, and I wanted to mention it. What does the Quran say about holy war and jihad? I will quote several verses from surahs. You know that the Quran is divided into these kinds of chapters, which are called surahs. This is from Surah 22, which is also called the Surah of Pilgrimage, as you can see. The terms continue to intersect here as well. Thus, 22:40:42. Permission has been granted to those who are attacked to react, as they are subjected to violence, and certainly God can assist them. They have permission to fight those who have been expelled from their homes without right, solely because they said, "Our Lord is God." God will certainly help those who help him. God is strong and powerful. Here, if this were the only thing, I believe we would struggle a lot to recognize jihad as we understand it. But commentators agree that this is one of the passages where the concept is clearly defined. In other words, what comes out? That jihad is legitimate and indeed prescribed in this specific case. In other cases, we will see that it expands and is clear. But in this specific case, it is said to be legitimate for self-defense when one is attacked. Do you understand, perhaps, why for centuries the Arabs had little need to concern themselves with jihad? After the great Arab conquests of the 7th, 8th centuries, the Islamic world was much more advanced and progressed than Catholic Western Europe, and they were essentially not threatened by anyone. But as soon as the first Crusaders set foot on Muslim land, the news spreads like a wave throughout the Islamic world, evoking this kind of attitude. The fact that in the book, God has said that those who are attacked must defend themselves, and God will help them. But in reality, there is a passage in another surah, the second, where jihad is theorized in a distinctly broader way, because here the issue becomes what to do with those who do not recognize the true God. And here are the passages. I must also mention the single most disturbing verse contained in the Quran on this matter, and as always, there are corrections, adjustments, and elements of moderation. Fight in the way of God against those who wage war against you. But do not exceed limits, for God does not love those who exceed. Kill them wherever you find them, and drive them out from where they have driven you out. Please excuse me for insisting on this, but you see how deep in the Quran, and therefore in the collective mindset of the Islamic world at many moments, is the idea that it is a scandal, that in certain areas, in certain cities, in certain regions, the true faith once triumphed and then the unbelievers arrived. This helps us understand many things, in my opinion. But do not fight them near the sacred temple, unless they attack you there. And if they attack you, kill them. Such is the reward of the unbelievers. But if they desist, certainly God is indulgent and compassionate. Fight them until there is no more civil discord, and the religion is only that of God. But if they desist, then let there be no more hostilities, except against the wicked. Here lies all the contradiction, which I dare to call so, often fruitful in certain aspects, but nonetheless also unsettling, of the Quranic conception of holy war, where it is strongly emphasized that war must be waged primarily against those who attack us. Yet the mere existence of people who deny God is felt as an aggression. And so the people who deny God must be fought until they can no longer cause harm. To no longer cause harm means that they submit. Here is the basis, because I said fruitful, a positive aspect of all this is that in the great Islamic empires of the past, as we know, there was not tolerance. The word was wrong, but Christians and Jews could live there, provided they recognized the superior authority of the Islamic authorities, paid special taxes, and so on. Because the Quran states explicitly, if they lay down their arms and submit, they can continue to live among you. However, obviously, in a subordinate position, In the Quran, and there is even a surah, a passage, in which it says, but the indications on holy war are a bit confusing. Why is there not a clear one? 47:22. Coming. 47:22. They say those who believe. Why has not a surah been revealed that commands war? But if a specific surah had been revealed, and war had been commanded in it, and then I prefer to paraphrase rather than translate because the following sentence is particularly complicated, it seems that the meaning is that there are simply too many who are too weak to truly fight, and God did not want to put them in such difficulty by ordering war. Therefore, it is not ordained by him. It is the earthly authorities that can ordain it, and the faithful must know how to orient themselves according to the situation. Therefore, the Quran itself acknowledges that the issue of holy war is a complicated, ambiguous matter that has not been formally declared. But there is still one moment, and the most surprising one in my opinion, in which these things are discussed. There aren't many. The passage of the Quran is a large book, as you can see. But there aren't many excerpts that talk about holy war, even though you have seen that those that do address the issue take the bull by the horns, so to speak. Here, the surprising passage is this: fight in the way of God, and know that God hears, and knows everything. After that, as often happens, God, or Muhammad, who transcribes, explains the concept by making references to what you have already known from previous revelations. Did you not see the assembly of the children of Israel after the death of Moses, when they said to one of their prophets, "Give us a king, and we will fight in the way of God"? Then the prophet said, "But if you are commanded to fight, you will certainly fight." And they answered, "How could we not fight in the way of God, seeing that we are driven out from our homes and our children?" And yet, when they were commanded to fight, they turned their backs, except for a few of them. But God knows the wicked. And it continues by recounting that indeed the prophet gave the Jews a king, Saul, and Saul led them into war, and they waged war against their enemies, the Philistines. And David killed Goliath, and so on. In other words, Muhammad is referring to a very specific biblical passage. He is referring to the second book of Samuel, which recounts exactly this, although with nuances that do not come through in the Quran. In the second book of Samuel, it is told that after the Jews had been governed by Samuel, who did not want to be king, now that Samuel is approaching death, and his sons are unable to take over the succession, the Jews ask Samuel to appoint a king. And Samuel does not want to. And he says, "But do you know what it means to have a king? He will take your sons to lead them into war. He will take your oxen. He will make you pay taxes," and so on. And the Jews say, "No, we want to be a people like all the others." What do they say? "We will have a king who will govern us, who will lead our soldiers and fight our battles." And Samuel goes to God and says, "Look, these people want a king." And God tells him, "Well, if they really want it, grant their request." And Samuel appoints Saul. So, what is the point? This passage in the book of Samuel is ambiguous, because it is not clear that having a king and following him into war is a good thing. In fact, it seems that Samuel thinks differently and advises against it. However, it is also true that when this king arrives, and he is indeed a wayward king, Saul, after him there will be David, there will be the kings of Israel, and the Jews will fight a series of wars that the Bible presents as sacred and victorious. As I was saying, Muhammad is well acquainted with Jewish and Christian tradition when he receives his revelations and articulates his ideas, drawing extensively from what he finds useful. Here, he simplifies things a bit. The fact that in the book of Samuel, it is not so clear whether this war is just or not is where it falls short. For Muhammad, fighting the enemies of God is just, and God has already said this many times. He said it to the prophets of the Jews, and is now reiterating it to Muhammad. I believe there is enough to reflect on the complexity of these intertwined religious faiths, and how complex the issue is, regarding how much believers should follow the precepts. I would add one last thing as a historian. As historians, we realize that the sacred texts remain the same. but different eras interpret them in their own ways. As I was saying, in the Islamic world, there was very little discussion about holy war in the 9th, 10th, and 11th centuries. But as soon as the Crusaders arrive, already during the First Crusade, at the first battle lost by the Muslims in which many fall and many flee, the Crusaders pursue them, and the first Arab chroniclers who recount this event are already writing. Only a group of mujahideen held firm. Mujahideen, that is, the fighters of the Holy War, of course. Mujahideen, by the way, excuse the detail, comes directly from jihad. The root of jihad with the prefix mu, which indicates people who do something, means that the mujahideen are those who engage in jihad. Only a group of mujahideen held firm and fought to gain merit with God and seek martyrdom. The Franks killed thousands of them and so on. Behold, the reaction is immediate. I don't know if this helps us understand why these people, who in the end reasoned in such a similar way, who worshipped the same God, even if with different rules, and who had such similar mental attitudes, I don't know if this helps us understand why their wars were so fierce. They were. One of the most striking things about the accounts of the early Crusades is seeing how joyfully Christian chroniclers recount the Crusaders returning victorious with the heads of the Turks hanging from their saddles or impaled on pikes. On the other hand, enthusiastic Arab chroniclers tell of how their warriors return with the heads of Christians hanging from their saddles. There it is. There it is. Some historians who have studied the Crusades for a long time have ended up saying that the subject is somewhat disheartening and that it is not one of the more exciting chapters in human history. The Crusades are also the moment when these different civilizations, although so interconnected without knowing it, did not even suspect how close they were, how linked they were. These different civilizations meet and describe each other. And so tomorrow, we will return not to analyze but to tell, and we will recount how those who did not come from the West, those who lived outside of Byzantium, or in the Islamic world, viewed our ancestors, who set out with all this baggage of ideas that we have tried to evoke. Thank you. Good evening. So yesterday we embarked, as many of you will remember, on a difficult journey. We compared the Christian idea of holy war with the Islamic idea of jihad, and in discussing it, some things came to light that may have surprised and perhaps even negatively impacted many of us. I also get involved because the things I am telling you are not all things I already knew beforehand. Many have emerged precisely from studying to prepare for this meeting. I must say that upon reflection, it is still surprising to see how far Christian thought has gone in theorizing and exalting holy war, comparing not only the act of dying while fighting against the infidels, but also the act of killing them to martyrdom and thus to sanctity. At the same time, it is nonetheless striking the incisiveness with which in certain pages of the Quran, the war against the infidels, against the enemies of God, is presented as a necessary endeavor in which one must engage. But perhaps the thing, excuse me for making this little summary, is that one tends to reflect on what has been said, to wonder what impression it might have made. And I found myself especially reflecting on this aspect, which is one of those things I didn't know before, and that came to light while I was working on it, about how deeply the idea of jihad is rooted in the Quran through biblical references. This is truly a lesson. It has been for me, but I believe it is really an example of what, in short, what is the purpose of us historians after all? We serve to bring to light things that are usually not considered and that somewhat disrupt our ways of seeing. Why do I make this long preamble, this lengthy reference to yesterday? Because I believe that yesterday it became quite clear from the texts, and therefore from the facts, how difficult it is to do that thing which we always do, which we enjoy doing so much, simplifying, seeing things in black and white, us and them, and of course we are right and they are wrong. As the Song of Roland, which I quoted yesterday, puts it so well, pagans ont tort et chrétiens ont droit. The pagans are wrong and the Christians are right. However, the Song of Roland is a work of extraordinary poetry, but it is not exactly the ethical manual I would propose for the 21st century, of course. And so, this strong tendency that we all have to see the world divided between us and them, yesterday we tried to challenge it a bit, to question it. But tonight we are fully plunging back into it. Because tonight we will tell the story of the Crusaders, as they were seen by them. And they did not concern themselves with these subtleties that I am trying to make with you. The others, the different ones who saw the Crusaders, were very willing to reason in terms of us and them. We will talk about how the Crusaders and, in general, the Westerners were viewed by the Byzantines. And we will discuss how the Crusaders and, in general, the Westerners were viewed by the Muslims. I will start with the Byzantines, and I will speak especially about a witness who is actually a female witness. How nice it is to be able to occasionally mention a woman in this story, which so far has, I fear, been entirely a story of men, of males, the one I have told. We will talk about the Byzantine princess named Anna Komnena, who was the daughter of the emperor, the daughter of the Basileus, Alexios Komnenos, which was lived between the 11th and 12th centuries, thus precisely during the years of the First Crusade. It was already large. It saw the arrival of the Crusaders who, you remember, walked to the Holy Land and thus passed through the Byzantine Empire, stopping in Constantinople, perhaps too much for the tastes of the local inhabitants. Anna Komnena saw them, and being an extremely cultured young lady who was capable of quoting Euripides and Homer, things that our Crusaders obviously could not even imagine, makes it somewhat striking to think that these warrior leaders who set out from here and who obviously did not know Greek and were unaware that ancient Greek literature even existed, encountered people during their journey who actually read Euripides and were able to quote him. Thus, Anna is a character of extraordinary culture who at a certain point decides to spend her time writing a great book about the life of her father, the emperor. And since his father, Emperor Alexios, has been dealing continuously with these Westerners, they pop up from all sides. Perhaps it is not necessary, but let's do it anyway. A very quick context on what the Byzantine Empire means at that moment, and also more generally. Because even the Byzantine Empire in our Western culture is somewhat affected by the tendency to view different cultures and civilizations in a derogatory manner. So perhaps a few words to call them to mind beyond the fact that they were very cultured. All right, we've said that, but there is also something else. Who exactly are these Byzantines? What we are about to bring to light, what we are about to hear, we are about to see, what impression our ancestors from 1,000 years ago made on them. So, who are these Byzantines? They are the ancient Romans of the Eastern Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire is nothing other than the Eastern Roman Empire. Remember that the Roman Empire was divided into two parts, a western part that spoke Latin and an eastern part that spoke Greek. Also remember that at a certain point there are what we might call the barbarian invasions, and the Roman Empire collapses. Wait a moment. The Western Roman Empire collapses and gives way to these kingdoms of the Goths, the Lombards, and the Franks, from which we all somehow descend. But what about the Eastern Roman Empire? The Eastern Roman Empire did not collapse. An originally immense empire that included the Balkans, Greece, all of present-day Turkey, all of the present-day Middle East, Egypt, extended all the way to Persia, to Mesopotamia. This empire did not collapse. It remained. They continued to call themselves Romans, and they will stubbornly continue to call themselves Romans in Greek for another 1,000 years. However, they are Eastern Romans who no longer speak Latin, and now only speak Greek, and who feel very distant from the Westerners. These Westerners are heirs of Rome, but also heirs of the barbarians. Indeed, Anna Komnena makes it clear. These are the barbarians of the West. We are the true heirs of the ancient cultural tradition. They don't actually call themselves Byzantines. That's an invention of us Westerners to pretend that they are a bit strange, to forget that they are the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans, or rather the heirs of the ancient Greeks and the ancient Romans. This empire has a couple of things worth mentioning. It is an empire, however, multi-ethnic with a Greek language, Greek culture, and Roman political traditions. The law of Justinian prevails. It is multi-ethnic because it absorbs people from all over. Persians, Armenians, from all parts, especially from the east. They also hire Vikings for the bodyguard of the Roman emperor, it should be noted. However, at the level of generals, ministers, and intellectuals, they come from all the peoples of the east. An ethnically diverse empire held together by a very strong imperial and Christian ideology because they are naturally Christians. Theirs is the church that we call Orthodox, the church that prays in Greek rather than in Latin, that reads the Gospels in the original Greek instead of in Latin translation, and that is gradually distancing itself from the Latin church, or rather the two are diverging, understanding each other less and less, yet they are still Christians, of course. I will say one last thing to set the stage for this witness we are about to mention. Anakomnene, this Byzantine empire, is a large, centralized empire with an autocratic sovereign who is the Roman emperor. You can imagine that he considers himself the master of the world, possessing a very strong statist and centralist ideology. It is an empire where the Roman emperor commands everything and where the economy is rigidly subordinated to the will of the government, where there is almost no free trade but only state-controlled trade, where many taxes are paid, and intellectuals argue that taxes must be imposed to prevent there from being too many rich and too many poor. In short, an extraordinary empire that, during the centuries of the Crusades, is devoured and torn apart by the Westerners. They, on the other hand, have capitalism. There are the Venetians, the Genoese, unscrupulous merchants, free initiative, and free enterprise. I must be using an anachronistic terminology. Someone might be thinking it is the terminology that my colleagues who study the Byzantine Empire now use, because the deeper one goes, the more it becomes clear that this empire, precisely centralized, monolithic, and poorly equipped from certain points of view, has been literally stripped bare by Western merchants, and, of course, by the warriors of the Crusades. Now this is the world in which Princess Anna Komnene lives, and this is the world where the bands of the Crusaders arrive. On foot, from the north, at a certain point. First, the disorganized bands of Peter the Hermit, the poor who set off somewhat haphazardly without waiting for the princes to organize, and then gradually, the armies of the princes. Remember why we mentioned that the First Crusade is a somewhat leaderless crusade, as no European king sets out. The kings are very weak at that time. Many princes, counts, and dukes depart. Anna Komnene simplifies by referring to the counts Godfrey of Bouillon, the Count of Toulouse, Bohemond of Hauteville, and many others whom I do not enumerate. Even Anna Komnene does not enumerate them. At a certain point begins to say, this one has arrived. That one. Then he can no longer continue, he says. They were as numerous as the leaves, and flowers of spring, parenthesis, to quote Homer, because it is indeed an Homeric verse. And then he says, yes. I would like to mention all their leaders, but I prefer not to do so. Words fail me, especially because the names are unpronounceable. They talk about the barbaric languages that I frankly cannot transcribe, and there are too many of them. It is understandable. That is an autocratic empire, where there is the emperor and nothing else. The West is at the most acute moment of feudal dissolution, filled with small local lords or princes, each of whom rules as master in his own home. And so this army represents a society that is truly the opposite of what the Byzantines are accustomed to. Therefore, Anna Komnene sees them arriving. First, the voices come from the borders. They have stirred in the distant. West, they have left home, and then they really arrive. And Anna says that, in fact, the voices did not convey the magnitude of the phenomenon. There were many more than had been said at the beginning. And, in general, the event was much more terrible and laden with consequences than we had expected. I quote, because the entire West, and all the barbarians who lived between the Adriatic and the Pillars of Hercules, migrated en masse to Asia. I might be exaggerating a bit, of course. Not everyone left. But this feeling that there were huge masses of people was evidently felt in Constantinople. Now, note that the relationship between the Empire of Constantinople, the Byzantine Empire, and the Crusaders has been ambiguous from the very beginning. I may not have mentioned this in the first lesson when I outlined the overall characteristics of the Crusades. I could have said it then, but we will say it now. When Pope Urban calls the faithful to the crusade and says that we must go to liberate Jerusalem to open the way for pilgrims who are otherwise harassed, because in the Islamic world these Turks have emerged, who are new tribes that have taken power in the Muslim world. They are worse than the Arabs. They are more barbaric than the Arabs. They are also more dangerous. And Urban II also says that they are also attacking the Christians of the East. It is a rare moment. Rare because they do not care for each other. But it is a rare moment of solidarity that the Church of Rome demonstrates towards, at that time, the Christians of the East. They are explicitly mentioned by the Pope as one of the reasons why it is necessary to depart, because the Islamic world is in turmoil and, in addition to tormenting the pilgrims going to Jerusalem, they are also attacking the Christians of the East, that is, the Byzantine Empire. So all these people have vaguely heard from the preachers that in the East there are our Christian brethren and that we must help them. The Eastern Emperor, the Byzantine Emperor in Constantinople, receives letters informing him that certain princes are on their way and that they need to be welcomed. The Byzantines are somewhat divided, debating whether they could perhaps make use of these people after all. They consider that if the Crusaders are truly going to attack the Turks, it might be beneficial for them, as the pressure from the Turks was indeed being felt quite significantly on the Byzantine Empire. However, at the same time, the idea of seeing this enormous tide of barbarians arriving as they perceive them. They are Christians too, but Christians in a completely different way, with whom communication is difficult. One of the first things Emperor Alexius must do is find interpreters, people who at least know Latin, if they also understand those barbaric languages spoken by the Crusaders, such as Old French or Genoese, that would be even better. But without interpreters, it is impossible to communicate with them. Then it is necessary to recruit troops to escort them. Throughout the journey they make across the Byzantine Empire, the Crusaders are escorted, for their safety, of course. However, the more people there are to escort them, the better it is, in any case. Incidents are continuous. Why all this tide of people? Yes, it's easy for you to say, look, they are Christians too. Eastern Christians, in the eyes of the Westerners, are strange people. They struggle a lot to admit that these are not the enemies, that they need to go a little further. The real enemies are a bit beyond, the Turks. Thus, the crossing of the Byzantine Empire by the Crusaders is this extremely ambiguous moment in which, in theory, they are allies. In reality, there is little affection between them. They suspect each other, and the Byzantines breathe a great sigh of relief when the Crusaders finally pass by. However, they never seem to end because more keep arriving. After Peter the Hermit, the princes arrive, and then more princes, followed by reinforcements. Thus, for years, the Byzantine Empire has to deal with these people passing through. And who are they? What kind of people are these? Anna Komnena acknowledges that many of them have idealistic motivations, though not so much the leaders, but the masses. Anna Komnena knows the history. She has heard that the Pope preached the crusade, and says, I quote, surprisingly, it was successful. For the Byzantines, this idea of the crusade is a novelty. You know, it really seems like a bizarre thing to them. However, it is known that the Westerners are made in their own way. We will soon see how they are perceived by the Byzantines, and thus this idea has been successful. They set out in mass, filled with fervor and enthusiasm, crowding all the roads, warriors, civilians, families, and women, more numerous than the grains of sand in the sea or the stars in the sky, carrying palm branches, which are the typical symbol of the pilgrim, and crosses on their shoulders, which instead represent the new commitment to forge their path if necessary, fighting until the liberation of the tomb. Here, Anna Komnena says this, I quote, the simple people were moved with absolute sincerity by the desire to pray at the tomb of our Lord and visit the holy places. In the crowd, she perceives this ferment of people who have nothing to lose but are driven by truly religious motives. As for the leaders, she has her doubts. The leaders are those she knows best, among other things. They were at the palace all the time. In fact, as we will see, they could not get rid of them. The leaders knew them well. And these, he says, these ones only wanted to grab everything in reality. Afterward, of course, Anna Komnena, a representative of a refined civilization, finds herself dealing with those she considers barbarians. What does she do? She generalizes. She begins to make general judgments about those whom I, for lack of a better term, continue to call the Westerners. How do you refer to them? She also has her problems. Every now and then, the Latins, especially when she thinks about the religious difference, but in reality, the term she uses most, which may surprise you, is the Celts. Why does she refer to the Celts? It is simple because almost all the Crusaders of the First Crusade are French. Where do they come from? From Gaul. What do the ancient authors say? That Anna Komnena knows very well and has it in her library. Who inhabits Gaul? The Celts. Therefore, Celts. Godfrey of Bouillon is a Celt. Now, what characteristics do the Celts that she has known well possess? Very ambitious. Each leader desires to surpass their peers. All these leaders are equal, countless, and they have no king. Each leader is determined to assert themselves, to show that they are better than the others, and to grab more than the others. As a race, they are very greedy. They are hotheads. Not like us who are intellectuals with an ancient civilization behind us. You see how generalizations are made on a grand scale, right? She fully believes in these generalizations. We are rational people. These are barbarians, and therefore, like all ancient Romans and ancient Greeks, Anna Komnena is also convinced that barbarians have certain characteristics, and they are as follows. How are the barbarians? Irrational. Passionate. Of course, they left home for this bizarre idea of going to liberate the Holy Sepulchre. Just imagine. It's all been proven. It's true that the barbarians are like that. The Latin race always shows an exceptional greed for wealth. But when it sets out to invade a country, it is not restrained by reason or strength. However, they are also great warriors. Not at all. The First Crusade triumphs and they manage to conquer Jerusalem, because it is true that at that time, the Westerners were a bit ahead of the others from a military standpoint. Military technologies, tactics, and the Western cavalry as weaponry and a method of fighting are revealed to be absolutely superior to anything the Byzantines or the Turks are able to deploy at that time. This is recognized by everyone. Anna Komnene says it, at least, 3 times, using the adjective irresistible. When they set off, they all ride together, covered in iron with their lances. They are irresistible, and could even break through the walls of Babylon. However, they are certainly still irrational barbarians. They do not think. If you withstand the first charge, an intelligent general is able to find the tricks, the arts. They do not study. They are barbarians. And instead, a general who has studied is able to defeat them. Saladin will think these things a few years later. What other characteristics do these barbarians have? They are rude. They are rude and very talkative. They do not know how to behave in front of the emperor. And of course, because they are great feudal lords used to recognizing nothing above themselves. Yes, when it suits them, they pay homage to a king or an emperor at their home, but it is a formality. In reality, these great leaders consider themselves independent sovereigns. They cannot behave at the court of a Roman emperor. Scenes occur that would make your hair stand on end. The emperor is patient, because even if he wanted to, now that there is this mass of people arriving, he wouldn't be able to stop them by force. So it is better to welcome them properly and let them pass. He has to receive all the leaders who arrive. And these leaders, they are all leaders. One arrives with 20 knights and he is a leader, so he must also be received. Therefore, there are constantly many of them at the palace. They bring all the friends they want. And they start talking in front of the emperor, Anna says. And they do not behave like the orators of antiquity, who would set the hourglass. And when the hourglass was finished, so was the speech, because the Celts are loquacious by nature. They enjoy listening to themselves, and they never know when to stop. The emperor sat on his throne, demonstrating immense patience in listening to all the endless speeches of these leaders. And when he is on the throne, it is still fine, because once, when he was not on the throne, they entered the throne room and one of them sat on the throne. And the imperial eunuchs arrived to explain to him that it was not allowed, and at one moment he drew his sword, but fortunately his friends explained to him that at the court of the Basilius, the emperor of the East, only the emperor can sit, while the others must stand. And this one left grumbling something in his language. And then Anna had it translated. What was he saying? He said that Rosso is sitting alone among all these noble gentlemen. Here, we can clearly see the contrast between the Byzantine ideology of autocratic power and the feudal ideology in which all leaders are equal and all sit together if necessary. Then Anna is also struck, for example, by the Latin clergy. Certainly, she sees him in action during the crusade. She may not see the best examples, but she sees or is told about priests who accompany the Crusader army and also carry weapons. It would be prohibited. Even in the West, it is prohibited. The canons of the Church forbid it. However, we know that in reality, during these centuries in which the Western world is dominated by a caste of warriors, of knights who fight, who by definition recognize the highest values in knowing how to fight, being courageous, and so on. Well, even the clergy, which is essentially recruited from the same knightly aristocracy, often fights as well. We know this. There are countless examples. Anna generalizes a bit. The Latins don't concern themselves with such subtleties. They don't grasp them at all. We, our priests, would never think of making them fight. We respect the canons, we respect the teachings of the gospel, but, I quote, the Latin barbarian is capable at the same time of handling sacred objects, wielding the shield with his left arm and holding the spear with his right. The same priest who administers the body and blood of the deity participates in, or at least witnesses, the massacres in battle. Thus the race, a grand word, when one wants to generalize, falls there. Thus the race is equally devoted to religion and war. Different from us Romans, evidently, in the eyes of Anna. And yet, to conclude with Anna Komnene. At a certain point, a phrase emerges, a single phrase, that opens up a whole new perspective on how these Byzantines could view the Crusader leaders and their knights. Because Anna, to summarize, is a Porphyrogenita princess, born in the purple, heir to a great culture, to a great civilization. She is Euripides. She is an intellectual. She is a woman. These rough men arriving on horseback wielding lances do not particularly seduce her. But her father, who was a warrior himself and understood how important it was to know how to fight while governing the empire, appreciated other qualities as well, such as physical strength, valor, courage, loyalty, and so on. At one point, Anna Komnene let slip that her father indeed had a certain admiration for them. It is an episode. Some of these Crusader leaders have fallen into captivity, prisoners of the Turks. And the Basileus Alexios Komnenos is astounded and deeply distressed at the thought that these leaders have been captured. He tells Anna that for him, these men, in the prime of their lives, at the height of their strength, of noble lineage, seem to rival the heroes of antiquity, with the Byzantine world, which from the perspective of building a chivalric and warrior culture, is lagging behind the Western one. I imagine, in short, Alexios Komnenos, having read and heard about Achilles, Ajax, and so on many times, and in his civilized world there is nothing comparable. Instead, seeing these, he finds them again. After crossing the Byzantine Empire, as you know, the Crusaders begin to come into contact with the Muslims. They come into contact with a Muslim world, where, as we mentioned, the ruling groups are no longer Arabs, but are Turks. The Arabs are those who made the great conquests after Muhammad preached the Islamic faith. The Arabs are those who, in the 7th century, conquered the entire Middle East, North Africa, and Spain. They founded a civilization that will continue to speak Arabic, of course, just as the Quran is in Arabic. However, within this Muslim world, for some time now, since the start of the First Crusade, different peoples, new peoples from Asia, the Turks, have also arrived. The Turks are not Arabs at all. They speak a language that has nothing to do with Arabic, yet they convert to Islam and conquer much of the Muslim world. To conquer means that in many places, the Sultan, the Emirs, local leaders, and warriors are usually Turks, or Kurds, sometimes like Saladin, who was Kurdish. In this world of Arab culture, where Arabic remains the language of religion, politics, and so on, but where the military elites are Turkish, this world is better equipped than the Byzantine one to understand the Crusaders. In reality, there are more similarities. This is also a world governed by an elite of warriors, with military, chivalric values that greatly appreciate fine horses, beautiful weapons, and courage in battle. This is also a feudal world if we want, because with the Turkish invasions, the Arab Empire has shattered, and the Caliph in Baghdad counts for very little now. There is indeed a Turkish sultan who is not very significant himself, and many local emirs. This is also why the First Crusade succeeds, as it encounters a divided Islamic world made up of many separate principalities, often at war with each other. However, this indeed implies a feudal mentality, if you will, if you allow me to simplify, which means that, in the end, the Turks are not so different from the Western warriors. When they meet, as we will see later, there is also an element of recognition. How do Muslims react to the arrival of the Crusaders, and what impression do they make on them? Let's say a few very general things. They absolutely cannot convince themselves that they come for idealistic reasons. They have come to invade, to take us away from our home, and they are, as the Byzantines also say, the greediest race that has ever been seen. They are very good in war. This is something that Muslims readily acknowledge. There is nothing to be done about it. That charge of their cavalry is truly irresistible. In short, the leaders who manage to prove they can stand up to the Christians, the Crusaders, the Franks, as the Arabs usually say, are truly the most skilled. Afterward, following the success of the First Crusade and the establishment of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, an era of continuous guerrilla warfare begins, marked by clashes, conflicts, but also by meetings, truces, negotiations, and trade, as is inevitable. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Crusader kingdom, does not last 2 centuries. Even though it is in continuous conflict with the Muslim world, without countless moments of encounter and dialogue of a significant nature, they would not have appreciated it, in my opinion. However, there are moments when one is forced to negotiate, moments when a single emir no longer wishes to wage jihad and prefers to come to an agreement with the neighboring Christian prince. There are many moments like this. And we are fortunate that one of these small Turkish princes, the Emir of Shazar, Caesarea, in Syria, has written a book in which he recounts a lot of anecdotes from his personal experience as a local Muslim prince who fought extensively against the Crusaders, but also negotiated and dealt with them a great deal. This gentleman is named Usama. The spelling is customary with a U, but it is obviously the same Islamic name much more widely known today thanks to another gentleman, Osama. This is called Osama ibn Munkir, and I will quote, read, or recount to you at various moments some passages from his book that outline a journey in the examination and observation of these strange people who are the Franks. The Franks are strange people, there is no doubt about that. They are crude and ignorant. The Turks also have no difficulty with this. However, there are also examples of their crudeness and ignorance. For instance, the practice of medicine among the Crusaders. I know very well that generally it is better to tell stories rather than read them, but I would also like to convey in some way the style of this author who writes in Arabic, and who is translated here into Italian, of course. So I would start by trying to read one of these passages, at least a piece, and then we can comment on it. Usama recounts that a certain Christian lord had asked him to send a doctor because there were sick people, and the Christians were unable to treat them. Therefore, during a moment of truce, they asked the Muslim emir to send them a doctor, and the emir sends a doctor, a Christian doctor named Tabit. A certain Christian, an Arab Christian. This is because in the Muslim world, there are many Jews, Christians, and so on, but he is an Arab of Arab culture. The doctor returned after not even 10 days. We asked him, "Did you manage to cure those patients quickly?" And he recounted, "They presented to me a knight who had an abscess on his leg, and a woman suffering from a wasting disease. I made a poultice for the knight, and the abscess opened and improved. I prescribed a diet for the woman, refreshing her temperament. When a Frankish doctor arrived, he said, "This one does not know how to treat them at all." He turned to the knight and asked him, "What do you prefer, to live with one leg or to die with two legs?" And having answered that he preferred to live with one leg, he ordered, "Bring me a strong knight and a sharp axe." A knight and an axe came, and it is always the Arab doctor who tells, and I was there present. He placed his leg on a wooden stump and said to the knight, "Give it a strong blow with the axe to cut it cleanly." And he struck her with a first blow, before she could be severed by a second blow. The marrow of the leg splattered away, and the patient died instantly. Having examined the woman, she said, "This was the one who suffered from consumption. Kostea has a demon in her head that has fallen in love with her. Cut her hair." They cut her, and she went back to eating their foods, garlic and mustard, which caused her illness to worsen. The devil entered her head, he declared, and taking the razor, he opened her head in a cross shape, removing her brain until the bone of the skull appeared, which he rubbed with salt. And the woman instantly died. At this point I asked, "Do you need me any more?" They answered no, and I left, after learning about their medicine what I had previously ignored. After that, let's try to turn the situation around as well, because it is clear that our Tabith, an Arab Christian, has behind him a highly refined medical culture, which is the Greek one, of course. The Arabs have the Greek authors. They read them. They use them. So it is a medicine based, in short, on the conception of humors, on the balance of humors. It is the same medicine that will later be rediscovered in the West and practiced during the Renaissance and the modern age, even in Europe. It is a medicine based on a highly refined cultural translation, and is, moreover, a completely ineffective medicine, because the theory of humors has no scientific foundation whatsoever, and therefore no ancient or Renaissance physician ever cured anyone except by chance while following those precepts. Certainly it sounds much more refined compared to the surgery of the Westerners. And yet, when I say surgery, I am not exaggerating, because this operation of, how shall I put it, trepanation of the skull described this way is somewhat impressive. But we know that in those centuries in the West they really begin to study the possibility of drilling into the skull in certain cases and healing people from cranial trauma in that way. In other words, if we wanted to, stretching things a bit but not too much, turn the tables, we could almost say that those unfortunate Christians who can only heal by cutting and sawing are still us, as we actually cure diseases here, those where it is possible to cut, saw, stitch, and so on. And in some way, we really see, in short, an element of Western civilization that is already taking hold at that moment. Besides being barbaric, the Christians, the Western Christians, the Franks, have a characteristic that is absolutely surprising in the eyes of Emir Osama. They have no jealousy over their women. They treat their women with an absolutely scandalous and shameful freedom. Among the Franks, there is no trace of a sense of honor or jealousy. If one of them walks down the street with his wife, and another man encounters them, the latter takes the woman by the hand and pulls her aside to talk to her, while the husband stands to the side, waiting for her to finish the conversation. If she takes too long, he leaves her with her interlocutor and goes away. One can imagine Osama's friends hearing these things. What kind of people are these Franks who take women to the street and then leave them with a friend they meet? A direct experience of mine in this regard is this. When I came to Nablus, I stayed in a house that served as a hotel with windows that opened onto the street. On the other side of the street was the house of a Frank who sold wine on behalf of the merchants. 3 lines follow that. They are not necessary to understand the story, but in my opinion they should still be read. This Frank would take a bottle of wine and promote it by announcing that such a merchant has opened a barrel of this wine Whoever wishes to purchase it can find it on this street, and I will let him taste the wine that is in this bottle. Remember when I told you that Italian merchants devour the Byzantine Empire as if it were nothing? Well, there is already a capitalist ability to manage business that extends to advertising. Now, this merchant is the protagonist of the anecdote. One day, as Usama recounts, he came home and found a man in bed with his wife. He asked him, "What brought you here to my wife?" "I was tired," the man replied, "and I came in here to rest." "And how did you get into my bed?" "I found a made bed and I lay down to sleep. And this woman is sleeping with you." "And the bed is his," he replied. "I couldn't exactly stop her from entering her own bed." "By my faith," the first one concluded, "if you do it again, we will fight." And this was all his reaction, and the greatest outburst of his jealousy. One can also imagine the Muslim readers snickering, of course, quite a lot. It is also reasonable to wonder if such a story could have ever happened. It is unlikely, of course. However liberal the customs of our ancestors may have been, they certainly did not react this way when they found their wife in bed with another man. But the Muslim enjoys imagining it that way. On the other hand, it is true that even though these stories are not realistic, they are somewhat part of our medieval imagination, because in Boccaccio we find as many such stories as we want. This fact, however, that the Franks are not jealous of their women, is something that strikes Usama so much that he revisits it, and he revisits it with another anecdote. Scandalous. No, it's not scandalous, I'll tell it. It's not scandalous at all. Another similar case is this, narrated to us by a lifeguard from Mahara, named Salim, who was in my father's bath. Says Usama, "A bath, that is, a Turkish bath, a bathhouse, a spa, an establishment, right? A prince can own one, have lifeguards working for him. Then he goes into business for himself. He lost a bath in Mahara," this man said, "to make a living. A Frank knight entered the establishment. Yes, because naturally the Crusaders who arrived in the East also discovered this delight that has since fallen out of fashion, the Turkish bath. Not that baths had disappeared in the West, as is often believed. That is not true. There was a certain tradition, but the thermal baths, in the ancient Roman way, were no longer so prevalent in the West. Instead, of course, they find it in the Middle East. And we immediately see that the Crusaders are great frequenters of these Turkish baths, which they find to be very pleasant places. A Frank knight entered the establishment, who did not like to wrap a cloth around his waist in the bath. The first time I read this, I was astonished, because which Christian author of this era, most of whom are monks, tells us that when the knights bathed, they did so naked. And instead, here it is literal. It is known that they like to bathe naked. Then there are these people. These Franks are a bit rough, sleight of hand, peasant tricks. They reach out and even snatch the towel from the lifeguard's waist. So he saw me that I had just shaved the pubic area. Salim exclaimed. I approached him, and he extended his hand. Salim said, "Magnificent. Oh my, do this service for me as well." And he lay down on his back. He had a fleece there, as long as his beard. He shaved it, and as he passed his hand over it, he found it beautifully smooth, and said, "Salim, my dear, do the same for the lady." And lady, comments Usama, who clearly uses a word that is directly felt in Old French, dame, and lady in their language means mistress, that is, his wife. The lady comes, she is also shaved. The lifeguard is generously rewarded, and the knight is very happy. But what is fascinating is Usama's conclusion after telling this story. Look at this contradiction. They have neither jealousy nor a sense of honor. He clearly cannot separate himself from jealousy. A man who does not keep his wife well guarded cannot have honor. And at the same time, they have so much courage, which usually arises only from a sense of honor and disdain for anything poorly done. Here you can truly see the clash of civilizations, if you will, right? That is, how someone who is confined within the values of their own civilization fails to interpret the behavior of others. It doesn't work for him. The fact that they are simultaneously so devoid of marital jealousy and so courageous in war is something that makes them incomprehensible. Just set this little light to shine. There. Not all Franks are the same, however. Not all Franks are the same. And Usama is very clear that the newcomers are the worst, those who have just arrived. But after they have been there for a while and have learned to understand the local customs, they improve significantly. Those who have been here forever are often people you can trust. The best of all, and this will surprise you just as it surprised me the first time I read it, the best of all are the Templars. Like the Templars, they are not those who have taken a vow specifically to fight. They have created a monastic order specifically to be able to fight, yes. But in the meantime, they are people who spend their whole lives in the Holy Land. And they, certainly, spend half their time fighting and the other half negotiating, as is always the case. Therefore, those who have more experience are better able to interact with the Muslim leaders and appreciate their ways, without being surprised, while those who have just arrived from Europe are truly unbearable. Usama recounts, a trait of the coarseness of the Franks, may God confuse them, is that in good classical Arabic style, it is appropriate when speaking of the infidels to add exhortations of this kind. One aspect of the rudeness of the Franks, may God confuse them, is this: when I visited Jerusalem, I used to enter the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Thus, at this moment, Jerusalem is in Crusader hands, and the capital of the kingdom Saladin has not yet been reconquered. However, we learn here, and this is something that would not be done in Europe, that in Jerusalem, Muslims enter and go to pray in the mosque. The mosque is still there. Right next to the mosque, the Franks built a church. And so Usama enters the Al-Aqsa Mosque, which is managed by the Templars. He even says, my Templar friends. And he says they let me pray peacefully in the Al-Aqsa Mosque, in a corner of the mosque. One day I entered, said the formula, Allah Akbar, God is great, and was about to start praying, facing towards Mecca, of course. A Frank arrives, rushes towards him, and forcefully moves him so that he faces east. Because in the Middle Ages, it was taken for granted that when praying, one must face east. And this was something so deeply ingrained, so strongly internalized by the people, that seeing someone praying not facing east seemed like a scandal. He forcibly turns him towards the east, saying that this is how one prays. Fortunately, the Templars arrive, take the aggressor away, and thus Usama can continue to pray as he wishes. But after a while, the other one returns and wants to force him again to turn towards the east. And once again, the Templars intervene. They pushed him away and apologized to me, saying, he is a foreigner and has just arrived these days from the land of the Franks and has never seen anyone pray except with their face turned towards the east. That we prayed towards the east, perhaps we did not know. However, we all know that in the Christian conception, the figure of baby Jesus, in the arms of Mary, holds a significant place. Usama did not know because before meeting the Crusaders, he had no idea that there were people who made images representing a woman with a child and said that this was baby Jesus, that is, God as a child. The time they explain it to him, there is again the cultural shock. Usama cannot believe such a thing. A Frank arrives at a reception? No. Sorry, I am at the mosque. A great emir has gone to pray at the Mosque of the Rock. We are still in this multi-ethnic and multi-religious Jerusalem that the Crusaders, all in all, managed to handle. The emir goes to pray at the mosque. It is evidently a moment of truce, and someone comes to him and says, do you want to see the baby God? The emir, all in all, said, yes, fine, let's go see the baby God. And he led us ahead until he showed us the image of Mary with the little Messiah in her lap. This, he said, is the baby God. And Usama recounts this to illustrate how incredibly superstitious these Christians are, who believe that God, who is unattainable and cannot even be depicted according to Islam, can instead be represented as a child. And indeed it concludes, much higher and the Most High God than what the infidels claim. After that, and on this note I will conclude, Usama also experiences a bit of that same sentiment we saw with Emperor Alexios Komnenos, namely the idea that these people are different, they are rough, they are barbarians, but how beautiful they are. On their horses in armor, when they charge all together, they are irresistible. They are so courageous. Usama says it, repeats it several times. And the fascinating thing is that he has common ground for conversation with his Christian hosts. When he is with a Christian leader, often even with the king of Jerusalem, King Fulk, the successor of Godfrey of Bouillon, there are various moments when they discuss common ground, such as horses, for example, and falcons, because hunting with falcons excites them all, and they are all connoisseurs of these things. Generally, they talk about horseback riding and fighting on horseback. Now, the Westerners are all infatuated with chivalry, in the very technical sense. One is knighted, there is an initiation. Being a knight is also a legal status. You are better than others if you are a knight. Muslims do not have this, but they appreciate good knights and brave fighters. And there are often misunderstandings about this, because it happens that Usama is once at the court of King Fulk in Jerusalem, and they are chatting, and King Fulk says to him, "Ah, congratulations, because I have heard that you are a knight." Usama says, "Yes, I am a knight in the way of our people," because he senses that for the Franks, being a knight means something more complex. But here too, there is an intercultural misunderstanding that this time works in a positive sense. The king thinks that this handsome, brave, armed prince, etc., has been told that he is a true knight as well. There is much speculation about this matter in the literature of the Crusades, and I would like to conclude on this point because it is a fine example of how, despite the fierce will to misunderstand each other and to massacre one another, they sometimes found common ground precisely through misunderstanding. The Turkish elites and the Crusader elites are greatly admired. That anonymous knight who writes a history of the First Crusade, whom I have already mentioned in previous days, at one point makes a stunning remark. It recounts a battle, the first battle near Antioch, in which the Crusaders defeated the Turks after great difficulty and believing they were already all lost. Then they succeed, they win, they defeat the Turks, and the Crusader knight says, "Who could possibly be so wise and learned as to be able to describe the prudence, military capabilities, and strength of the Turks? It would require the worth of another. In short, I am not capable of saying it, how skilled these Turks are." The Turks fight in a very different way from the Western knights. They fight on horseback, but with bows and arrows, and do not charge. They charge with their lances, but keep their distance, bombarding the enemy with arrows, hopping around them, retreating, then returning, a typical Eastern way of engaging. The Crusaders initially looked down on him a bit, but then they realized that it works, and how, and that it takes quite a skill to do this. And indeed, our Crusader knight continues. They, the Turks, believed they could scare the Frankish people with the threat of their arrows, as they had frightened the Arabs, the Saracens, the Armenians, the Syrians, and the Greeks. But if God wills, they will never be as effective as ours. But anyway, and this is the most astonishing part, the Turks claim to be of the Frankish race, and that no man by nature should be a knight, except for the Franks and themselves. Here again is the misunderstanding. To be a knight for the Crusader means something very specific, legal, having been dubbed a knight, having taken on certain life commitments, such as protecting widows and orphans and so on. Behold, the Crusaders admire these Turks so much that at a certain point they become convinced that the Turks, unlike the Greeks or Byzantines, would be worthy of being knights. And here I won't quote him entirely, but our man keeps saying that if only these Turks were Christians, there would be no one who could stand up to them. And such is the admiration for these people that one cannot help but bring them into our group, into our civilization. Otherwise it is not understood. Otherwise it is like Usama, who says, "I do not understand them. They have no sense of honor, yet they are so courageous. I give up. They are incomprehensible people." Sometimes Christians do something different, saying, "Yes, these people are so good, but because deep down they are one of us." Let me explain better. The fact that the Turks share the same ancestry as the Franks is already revealing. But there is one particular thing I would like to conclude with. The man whom the Crusaders encounter on the other side during the Crusades and whom they admire the most, Saladin. What has truly given him the most trouble is the one who defeated the army of poor Guido of Lusignan by the Sea of Tiberias, as we mentioned the other day, who reconquered Jerusalem. The Saladin that remains etched in our collective memory, up to the fierce Saladin of the Perugian figurines from many years ago. Behold, all the writers of the Crusades, the authors of epic songs, greatly admire Saladin. And immediately after his death, a series of legends begins to circulate in the West, which say that Saladin secretly came to Europe. He came secretly to Europe and had himself knighted. When he was over there, during the Crusades, he had a story with Eleanor of Aquitaine. Some may remember this Amazon, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who accompanied the Crusaders and has also passed into legend. Even better, Saladin was actually the son of Christians. Then he was exchanged. This explains why he was so valiant and chivalrous. Saladin, on his deathbed, guess what he did? He converted to Christianity, of course. And this seems to me a beautiful example of how, even when one is a prisoner of the clash of civilizations and cannot escape the logic of one's own values, when one meets others and begins to get to know them, something goes into crisis. In short, some sort of short circuits are created in a way, and on this I believe I could also stop. Thank you.